My name is Clara. I am 31 years old and I am a senior financial analyst for a corporate firm in Chicago. Just 3 weeks ago, my entire world collapsed in an instant when my wonderful husband David suffered a sudden and fatal brain aneurysm. We were supposed to grow old together, build a family, and share decades of love. Instead, I found myself standing in a freezing downpour at his funeral, watching his mahogany casket being lowered slowly into the muddy earth. My heart was shattered into a million unfixable pieces. My hands trembled so violently I could barely stand on my own 2 feet. I turned around in the cold rain, desperately needing my parents to hold me. I needed my mother to hold my hand and tell me I was going to survive this waking nightmare. But the front row chairs reserved for my mother Brenda, my father Richard, and my older sister Jessica were completely empty. They had vanished from the cemetery before the burial service even ended, leaving me entirely alone beside my husband's grave. Later, that very same night, I discovered the sickening truth. While I was bearing the absolute love of my life, my own flesh and blood had secretly rushed across town to meet with a shady probate lawyer. Through a shocking twist of fate, I heard a recording of my mother whispering, "She's too broken to fight us now, just file the papers." They were plotting to steal David's entire $5 million tech startup equity while they thought I was incapacitated by grief. But the forged legal documents they were so eager to sign carried one specific name. They never expected a name that would lock their own greedy trap right back on them. Before I tell you exactly how I turned their greedy trap into a federal prison sentence, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. I read every single comment because sharing these painful experiences helps us all heal. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor during the darkest storms of your life, not the wolves waiting to tear your ship apart when you are sinking. If you have ever been utterly betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, you know exactly how cold that realization feels. It forces you to find a terrifying strength you never knew you possessed. You quickly realize that sometimes setting firm boundaries is not a betrayal of your family, but a necessary act of basic survival. So grab a cup of coffee and settle in, because the way I legally took down my toxic parents is a lesson they will never, ever forget. Now let me take you back to the graveyard where it all began, and where I finally opened my eyes to who my family truly was. The rain came down in relentless heavy sheets that afternoon, matching the absolute devastation tearing through my chest. The weather felt like a cruel reflection of my reality. I stood at the edge of the muddy grave, watching the polished mahogany casket descend slowly into the earth. Inside that casket was David, the man who had been my anchor, my best friend, and my entire future. The sudden brain aneurysm had stolen him from me in the blink of an eye, leaving me in a world that suddenly felt entirely empty and unrecognizable. The cemetery was draped in a suffocating gray mist, and the only sound was the steady drumming of the rain hitting the green canvas canopy stretched above us. The priest was reading the final committal prayers, but his words sounded muffled and far away, like I was listening to them from underwater. My black dress was clinging to my skin, heavy with the damp chill of the Chicago wind, but I could not feel the cold. I could only feel the massive hollow void where my heart used to be. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to clasp them together against my stomach just to keep myself upright. The mechanical whir of the lowering device echoed loudly. Every inch the casket dropped felt like another physical blow to my body. I was completely unspooled. I was drowning in a kind of grief that actually makes it difficult to draw oxygen into your lungs. I desperately needed someone to anchor me. I needed my mother. In that agonizing final moment as the gravediggers prepared to shovel the first layer of dirt, I turned around, expecting to find the comforting arms of my family. I turned around, needing my mother Brenda to hold my hand. I needed my father Richard to put a hand on my shoulder. I even needed my older sister Jessica to offer a single word of genuine comfort. I turned around with tears blinding my eyes, completely ready to collapse into their embrace. But I found nothing. The 3 folding chairs positioned directly behind me in the front row, the seats specifically reserved for the immediate family of the widow, were completely empty. The dark green fabric of the chairs was already slick with blowing rain, indicating they had not just stood up to stretch their legs. They had been gone for a while. I blinked through my tears, staring at those empty seats, trying to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. My mother, my father, and my sister had simply vanished. They had abandoned me at my husband's grave before the service was even finished. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me, replacing the numb shock of my grief with a sharp, agonizing sting of betrayal. I looked toward the paved road bordering the cemetery grounds and saw that my father's silver sedan was gone. They had actually gotten into their car and driven away, leaving me standing alone in the mud. As I stared at those 3 empty chairs, a bitter realization began to crystallize in my mind, cutting through the fog of my sorrow. This was exactly who they were. This was who they had always been. For my entire adult life, I had allowed them to treat me as nothing more than a convenient human ATM. I remembered the countless times my phone would ring late at night with my mother on the other end, using that familiar, desperate tone. I remembered the exact moment David and I sat at our kitchen table, pulling $20,000 out of our savings account to pay off a mountain of secret credit card debt my father Richard had racked up from his failed business ventures. He had looked me in the eye and promised to pay us back within a year. 5 years had passed, and he had never returned a single dime. But David, my kind, beautiful, generous David, had just smiled and told me not to worry about it because they were family, and family helps each other. I remembered funding Jessica's lavish lifestyle simply because my parents demanded that I keep the peace. Jessica was the golden child, the older sister, who could do no wrong, the one whose expensive tastes were treated as necessities, while my own needs were dismissed as dramatic complaints. When Jessica wanted an extravagant destination wedding in Napa Valley, my parents guilt-tripped me into covering the massive catering bill, claiming they were completely tapped out. I paid for the 5-star meals, the open bar, and the floral arrangements, while I worked grueling 50-hour weeks at the financial firm just to keep my own head above water. David never once complained about the financial drain my family placed on our marriage. He worked tirelessly at his tech startup, building his company from the ground up, and he always told me that my family's financial chaos would not break us. He carried their burdens simply because he loved me. He gave them his money, his patience, and his grace. And yet, when the time came to stand by my side and honor the beautiful life of the man who had literally paid to keep a roof over their heads, they could not even spare 20 minutes to watch him be buried. They took his money in life, but they could not be bothered to show him basic respect in death. The utter cruelty of their absence felt like a physical knife twisting in my back. They did not see me as a grieving daughter or a heartbroken sister. They only saw me as an endless resource, and with David gone, they clearly decided they no longer needed to pretend to care. I stood there trembling uncontrollably, my vision blurring as the reality of my complete isolation settled over me. But before my knees could give out, a shadow stepped up beside me. It was Marcus. Marcus was Jessica's husband. He had married into the family 4 years ago, and from the very beginning he was different. Marcus is an African-American architect, a man whose entire career is built on creating strong, lasting foundations, a stark contrast to the rotten, crumbling foundation of the family he had married into. He was a man of profound, quiet integrity who spoke carefully and loved deeply. He did not engage in the petty drama my mother constantly orchestrated, and he rarely participated in my sister's lavish spending sprees. He worked hard, earned his own way, and always treated me and David with genuine warmth and respect. Marcus stepped close to me, holding a large black umbrella firmly over my head, blocking the relentless downpour. I looked up at him, and the expression on his face made my breath catch in my throat. He was staring at the exact same empty folding chairs I was looking at. His jaw was clenched tight and a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek. His dark eyes were filled with a mixture of profound sorrow for me and a sickening absolute disgust for his wife and his in-laws. He knew they had left. He had stayed behind specifically because he saw them walk away and refused to let me stand at this grave entirely alone. He did not offer any empty platitudes. He did not tell me that they probably just went to the reception hall or that the rain was too cold for my mother. Marcus was too honest to insult my intelligence with lies. He knew exactly what this abandonment meant. He shifted his stance slightly, moving closer to shield me from the wind. His presence was a silent but incredibly powerful declaration of solidarity. In that exact moment, the contrast was blindingly clear. The people who shared my DNA, the people who had taken tens of thousands of dollars from the medicine lying in that wooden box, had fled the moment the situation became uncomfortable. But this man, a brother-in-law who owed me absolutely nothing, was standing in the freezing mud, ruining his tailored charcoal suit, simply because it was the right thing to do. I leaned slightly into his shoulder, drawing a tiny fraction of strength from his steady frame. The gravediggers began their work, and the heavy, wet sound of dirt striking the top of the mahogany casket echoed across the quiet cemetery. I kept my eyes fixed on the grave, letting the tears fall freely, mingling with the rain on my cheeks. I thought about David's gentle smile, his brilliant mind, and the countless ways he had protected me from the toxic demands of my parents. I realized then that David had been my only true family. With him gone, I was completely exposed to their true nature. Marcus placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder, gently grounding me to the present moment as the final shovelfuls of earth were moved. The service ended in a heavy, suffocating silence. The priest packed away his prayer book and offered me a final sympathetic nod before walking away toward his car. The few remaining friends and colleagues from David's company began to disperse, murmuring quiet condolences as they passed by, heading for the warmth of their vehicles. Soon it was just me, Marcus, and the freshly turned earth. I looked back at the empty green folding chairs one last time, embedding the image deep into my memory. I promised myself in that freezing graveyard that I would never ever forget the feeling of looking for my mother and finding empty space. I would never forget that when my world ended, my parents chose to walk away. I turned to Marcus and whispered a broken thank you. He just nodded, his expression remaining tight and troubled. Neither of us knew it yet, but the sheer cruelty of their early departure from the funeral was not simply a matter of selfishness or avoiding the rain. Their absence was not just a failure of empathy. It was a calculated maneuver. While I was standing in the mud, crying over my husband's grave, my parents and my sister were somewhere else entirely executing a plan so deeply vile that it would soon make my blood run completely cold. And Marcus, the man holding the umbrella over my head, was about to become the most vital ally I would ever have. The ride back from the cemetery was a blur of grey skies and silent tears. Marcus had offered to drive me, but I insisted on taking my own car, needing the physical isolation to match the gaping hole in my chest. Walking through the front door of the house David and I had bought just 3 years ago felt like stepping into a mausoleum. The silence was absolute and suffocating. His jacket was still hanging on the hook by the door. His favorite running shoes were still kicked off near the mat. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the hallway, unable to take another step, pulling my knees to my chest and weeping until my ribs physically ached. After what felt like hours, I dragged myself up from the floor and wandered aimlessly into the living room. The house felt too big, too empty, too devoid of the laughter that used to echo off these walls. Desperate for any piece of him, I picked up his iPad from the coffee table. I just wanted to see his face. I wanted to open his photo gallery and look at the pictures from our trip to Colorado last summer. I needed to see his smile to remind myself that the beautiful life we shared had actually been real and not just some cruel dream. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh blue glow in the dim living room. Because his devices were all synced to the cloud, a bright red notification bubble hovered over his voicemail icon. I stared at it, my brow furrowing in confusion. Who would be leaving a voicemail on a dead man's phone? My fingers trembled as I tapped the icon. The screen loaded, displaying a single new message. The caller ID made the blood freeze in my veins. It was my mother. I looked at the timestamp. The message had been recorded at 2:15 in the afternoon. That was the exact moment the priest had been reading the final committal prayers. That was the exact moment I had turned around in the freezing rain, desperately looking for my parents, only to find their folding chairs completely empty. My breath hitched in my throat. A heavy knot of dread formed in my stomach. Why would my mother call David's phone while she was supposed to be standing right behind me at his grave? I hesitated for a fraction of a second, terrified of what I might hear before pressing play. At first, there was only the muffled, scratchy sound of fabric rubbing against a microphone. It was a pocket dial. My mother had accidentally unlocked her phone inside her designer purse. For the first 30 seconds, I heard nothing but the rhythmic thud of walking and the faint sound of a car engine starting. Then a heavy door closed, and the ambient noise shifted to the sharp, distinct acoustics of an office. The muffled scratching stopped as the phone was presumably set down on a table, or perhaps the purse was left open on a chair. Suddenly, the voices came through with crystal clear, terrifying precision. I heard my father Richard clear his throat. Then my sister Jessica spoke, her voice completely devoid of the fake sorrow she had projected at the funeral home that morning. She sounded impatient, irritated even. "Are we sure this is going to work?" she asked. "She will not even know what hit her," a male voice replied. It was a voice I did not recognize, slick, professional, and dripping with greed. The attorney. I sat frozen on my couch, gripping the edges of the iPad so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mother, Brenda, chimed in next, her tone brisk and entirely businesslike. "We need to move fast before she snaps out of it. David's tech startup equity is worth at least $5 million now, and I refuse to let that kind of money slip through our fingers just because my daughter wants to play the grieving widow." A wave of pure nausea washed over me. I clamped my hand over my mouth, physically sickened by the words pouring out of the device. They had not left the cemetery because they were overwhelmed by grief or because they were trying to escape the rain. They had abandoned me at my husband's grave so they could rush to a lawyer's office and plot how to steal his life's work. The attorney spoke again, laying out their sickening strategy. "Once we file these claims, we can effectively freeze her accounts," he explained. "She will be locked out of the estate completely. We just need to make sure she does not contest the initial filing." Jessica laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed in the quiet of my living room. "Are you kidding me?" Jessica scoffed. "Clara is a total mess right now. She could barely stand up straight at the church. She is entirely dependent on us for emotional support. She will sign whatever Mom tells her to sign." I felt the tears drying on my face, replaced by a burning, searing heat radiating through my chest. Every single time I had defended them to David, every single time I had handed over our hard-earned money to bail them out of their self-inflicted crises, flashed before my eyes. Then came the final crushing blow. I heard the rustle of papers being shuffled across a desk. The lawyer asked if they were ready to proceed. I held my breath, waiting for someone, anyone in my family, to show a shred of humanity. I waited for my father to object, or for my sister to remember the man who had funded her lavish wedding. Instead, my mother's voice sliced through the audio recording, cold, calculating, and utterly heartless. Her whisper hissed through the speaker, carrying the weight of 1,000 betrayals. "She is too broken to fight us now. Just file the papers." The recording clicked and went dead. The silence returned to my living room, but it was no longer the silence of sorrow. It was the silence of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. I sat perfectly still in the dark, staring at the black screen of the iPad. The woman who had given birth to me, the father who was supposed to protect me, and the sister I had supported for years had just declared war on me on the absolute worst day of my entire life. They genuinely believed that my grief had rendered me weak. They truly thought that because I was mourning my husband, I had lost my mind and my ability to defend myself. They forgot one crucial detail, though. I was a senior financial analyst. I spent my days hunting down hidden assets, dismantling fraudulent corporate spreadsheets, and destroying people who tried to cheat the system. My sadness did not make me weak. It stripped away every single illusion I ever had about my family, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard clarity. They wanted to steal my husband's legacy. They thought I was an easy target, but as I sat in the darkness of my empty home, wiping the last tear from my cheek, a new emotion entirely consumed me. The grieving widow they thought they could manipulate was gone, and in her place was a woman ready to burn their greedy world to the ground. The audio crackled slightly, but the slick voice of the attorney cut through the static with terrifying clarity. He spoke with the practiced calm of a man who made a living ruining lives. I pressed the iPad closer. The lawyer began laying out the exact mechanics to dismantle my life. He explained that challenging the inheritance of a surviving spouse was messy. To steal an estate valued at $5 million quickly, they needed an airtight narrative bypassing standard probate. They needed a debt so massive that the court would instantly liquidate David's tech startup equity to satisfy the claim. I listened in pure horror as the lawyer told my father Richard the only way to bypass me was to prove David owed him everything before he died. The sixth strategy relied on a forged promissory note. The lawyer instructed my father on how to backdate a contract to the year David first launched his software company. I heard the rustle of heavy paper as the attorney slid a drafted template across the desk. He told Richard they would draft an agreement stating my father provided the crucial initial seed money for David's company. According to this fabricated document, David pledged his future company equity as collateral against this phantom loan. The lawyer explained that since David was dead, a highly convincing forgery of his signature, alongside a backdated notary stamp, would secure a temporary injunction against the estate. My stomach churned as I heard my father agree to this absolute lie. Richard even chuckled a low, greedy sound and suggested making the phantom seed money amount high enough to justify seizing every single asset we owned. The man who repeatedly begged my husband for money was openly plotting to forge his signature to steal everything we built. But the promissory note was not enough for them. They needed an insurance policy in case the courts questioned the business debt. The lawyer suggested supplementing the fake contract with a handwritten holographic will. He asked if anyone in the family had enough samples of David's handwriting to mimic his distinct penmanship. My older sister, Jessica, eagerly chimed in. Her voice was bright and terribly enthusiastic. She bragged that she had several old birthday cards and thank you notes from David saved at her house. She promised the lawyer she could spend the weekend practicing his signature until it looked flawless. She suggested writing a short, emotional letter claiming David secretly wanted his wealth to go to her and my parents because he owed them for welcoming him into the family. Listening to my sister volunteer to forge the handwriting of my deceased husband while he was literally being buried just miles away made profound nausea wash over me. As the recording continued, the depths of their delusion became horrifyingly clear. They began constructing a fake history to justify their theft. My mother, Brenda, spoke up, her tone laced with a sickening sense of entitlement. She told the lawyer they were not really stealing because David actually owed them this money for putting up with him. She wove a fantasy about how they financially supported David and me during our early 20s. It was an utter fabrication. The reality was, David and I worked 80-hour weeks so we could quietly pay off the second mortgage my parents recklessly took out. We funded Jessica's extravagant lifestyle and bailed Richard out of massive credit card debts. But in that lawyer's office, they completely rewrote history. They convinced themselves they were the generous benefactors, and stealing David's $5 million equity was simply collecting a long overdue debt. Hearing them twist David's generosity into a weapon was the most profound betrayal I had ever experienced. The final phase of their plan was the most calculated. The lawyer warned them that timing was the single most critical element of this entire operation. He stated clearly that they had to strike while I was completely incapacitated by my grief. He outlined the schedule with ruthless precision. They would spend the weekend perfecting the forged documents. Then first thing Monday morning, the very moment the courthouse doors opened, they would file the emergency injunctions. The lawyer explained that by claiming I was emotionally unstable and prone to making reckless financial decisions, the judge would immediately grant a freeze on all my banking accounts. By Monday afternoon, my credit cards would be declined. My checking accounts would be locked. I would not be able to buy groceries, pay my mortgage, or hire a competent defense attorney. They planned to financially paralyze me before I even wiped the tears from my eyes. They wanted to force me into a corner and make me so desperate and broken that I would surrender the entire estate just to survive. The recording ended with the sound of chairs scraping against the hardwood floor, and my mother happily asking where they should go for an expensive celebratory lunch. The audio cut out abruptly, leaving me in the deafening silence of my empty living room. For a long time, I simply stared at the blank screen of the iPad as a cold realization settled into my bones. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal threatened to suffocate me. They timed this perfectly, planning to ruthlessly exploit the absolute darkest moment of my life. They expected me to surrender blindly because that is what I had always done. I had always been the quiet, compliant daughter who silently absorbed their emotional abuse to keep the peace in the family. But they severely miscalculated. They completely forgot that I was a senior financial analyst. I understood complex corporate law, asset protection, and financial forensics better than anyone they could ever hire. The tears on my cheeks dried completely, leaving my skin tight and cold. My sorrow hardened into a sharp resolve. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare using my dead husband's legacy, then they had chosen the absolute wrong opponent. The digital clock on my microwave glowed bright red in the dark kitchen. It was exactly 11 at night. The rain had not stopped since the funeral. It battered against the glass patio doors like a swarm of angry fists. I was still sitting in the exact same spot on the hardwood floor, clutching David's iPad to my chest. The audio from my mother's accidental voicemail was still playing on a loop in my mind. She is too broken to fight us now. Those words echoed in the empty house, mocking my grief. I felt entirely hollowed out, a shell of the woman I had been just that morning. But beneath that hollow grief, a tiny spark of pure, unadulterated rage was beginning to catch fire. Suddenly, a sharp, harsh sound shattered the heavy silence of the house. The doorbell rang. I jumped, nearly dropping the tablet. Nobody comes to a grieving widow's house at 11 o'clock at night in a torrential downpour. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was my parents coming to finish the job they had started. I imagined my mother standing on the porch with her fake sympathetic smile, ready to force a pen into my hand. I forced myself up from the floor. My legs were stiff, and my entire body ached from the physical toll of crying for hours. I walked slowly down the hallway, holding my breath. I pressed my eye to the small glass peephole. Standing on my front porch, illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the security light, was Marcus. He was not holding an umbrella this time. The freezing rain was soaking right through his dark charcoal suit, the same suit he had worn to the cemetery just hours ago. He looked completely exhausted and deeply agitated. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open. The cold wind immediately swept into the foyer, bringing the smell of wet earth and impending storm. Marcus did not say a word at first. He just stood there, shivering slightly, the water dripping from his chin. "Come in," I whispered, stepping aside. Marcus stepped into the warmth of the hallway. He wiped the rain from his face with the back of his hand, looking around the quiet house as if expecting someone else to be there. I closed the door against the storm and locked it behind him. We stood in the dimly lit foyer for a long, agonizing moment. The only sound was the heavy dripping of rainwater from his soaked suit onto the oak floorboards. I did not ask him why he was here. I did not offer him a towel or a hot drink. The normal rules of polite society felt completely irrelevant in the wake of everything I had just discovered. Finally, Marcus let out a long, shaky breath. His broad shoulders slumped, as if he was carrying a physical weight that had simply become too heavy to bear. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion I could not quite place. It sounded like a mixture of profound shame and simmering anger. "I need to show you something." He reached inside the breast pocket of his wetsuit jacket. His large hands were trembling slightly. He pulled out several pieces of paper that had been folded over and over again until they were heavily creased. The edges were slightly damp, but the text was perfectly legible. He held the crumpled documents out to me. I hesitated, my eyes darting from the papers to his face. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just read it," he replied gently, pushing the papers into my hands. "Read it carefully." I carried the documents into the living room and turned on a single table lamp. The sudden yellow light stung my tired eyes. I sat down on the edge of the sofa and carefully unfolded the papers, smoothing the deep creases against my knee. It was a legal document. Specifically, it was a general power of attorney. I scanned the dense legal jargon, my training as a financial analyst kicking in almost instinctively. The document granted my father, Richard Myers, absolute and unchecked authority over the financial and medical decisions of David Sterling, my husband. I read the date printed at the top of the page. It was dated 3 days ago. That was precisely 1 day after David suffered his fatal brain aneurysm while he was lying in a hospital bed entirely unresponsive on life support. My eyes darted to the bottom of the second page. There, sitting on the signature line, was David's name written in bold blue ink. It was an incredibly convincing forgery. It captured the exact slant of his letters, the specific loop of his signature that I had seen on 1,000 checks and birthday cards. But it was a lie. A cold, calculated, absolute lie. Next to David's forged signature was a notary stamp perfectly embossed and dated. I stared at the blue ink until my vision blurred. I felt physically sick, as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from under me. They did not even wait for him to be in the ground. They started planning this while his heart was still beating. I looked up at Marcus. He was standing near the fireplace, watching me with a look of absolute disgust on his face. Not disgust aimed at me, but disgust for the family he had married into. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice trembling with a terrifying new rage. Marcus crossed the room and sat down heavily in the armchair opposite me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands for a brief moment. When he looked up, his dark eyes were completely hard. "I found it in Jessica's purse," he said, his voice flat and bitter. "After we left the cemetery, Jessica was acting strange. She was completely frantic, rushing me to get back to our house. She locked herself in her home office the second we walked through the door. She said she needed to make some urgent calls for work. But my wife does not work on weekends, and she certainly does not lock her door. About an hour ago, she finally came out to take a shower. She left her designer handbag sitting wide open on the kitchen island. I went to move it so the kids would not spill juice on it. That is when I saw the folder sticking out. The name David Sterling was printed across the top tab. I pulled it out and looked inside. Marcus stopped speaking and shook his head slowly, as if trying to physically dislodge the memory of what he had found. I saw her practicing the signature, Clara. He looked me dead in the eye. Tucked behind that forged legal document were 5 sheets of notebook paper, completely covered in your husband's name. She had been tracing his old birthday cards, trying to get the loop of the letter D exactly right. My own wife was forging a dead man's signature, while his body was barely cold. The air in the living room felt entirely suffocated. The absolute cruelty of my own sister, tracing my dead husband's handwriting to steal his life's work, was almost impossible to process. Marcus leaned back in the chair and let out a long, heavy sigh. "I have spent my entire life trying to be a good man," he said quietly. "I built homes for families. I tried to set an example of integrity for my children. I have put up with your parents' toxic behavior for years because I wanted to keep the peace. I tolerated their snide remarks and their constant demands for money because Jessica begged me not to cause a scene. But this," he gestured sharply toward the forged document in my lap. "This is a line I will never cross. I will not sit back and watch my wife and her greedy parents destroy a grieving widow. I will not look my children in the eye, knowing I let their aunt be completely ruined by the people who were supposed to love her." Marcus stood up, drawing himself to his full height. He looked entirely resolute, an immovable force of truth in a house that had just been shattered by lies. "I do not care what this does to my marriage, Clara." He spoke with absolute conviction. "I am officially drawing a line in the sand tonight. You need an inside man to take them down. You need someone who knows their schedule, who can watch their movements, and who can gather the evidence you need to put them exactly where they belong. I am offering to be that man. Tell me what you need me to do." I looked at the rain-soaked architect standing in my living room, risking his entire life to protect mine. I looked down at the forged signature resting on my knee, and in that exact second, a massive fundamental shift occurred deep within my soul. The weeping, shattered widow who collapsed in the hallway just hours ago died right there on the sofa. I stopped being the quiet, compliant daughter who always bent backward to keep the peace. I became a senior financial analyst who knew exactly how to dismantle a fraudulent corporate scheme. I folded the forged power of attorney with careful, deliberate precision and placed it on the coffee table. I wiped the final tear from my cheek and stood up to face Marcus. I looked him directly in the eyes, and for the first time since David died, I felt a surge of pure, focused adrenaline. "Thank you," I said, my voice completely steady and cold as ice. "Let us go to work." The moment Marcus walked out the front door and disappeared back into the freezing Chicago rain, my entire physical being felt fundamentally different. The crushing, suffocating weight of grief that had kept me pinned to the hardwood floor just an hour ago had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a sharp, icy clarity that radiated from the center of my chest all the way down to my fingertips. My sorrow had officially morphed into a cold, calculating fury. I walked into my home office. The room was dark, except for the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and stared at the blank monitor of my work laptop. I am a senior financial analyst. I spent 50 hours a week hunting down corporate discrepancies, dismantling fraudulent spreadsheets, and exposing executives who think they can hide stolen money behind clever accounting tricks. My parents and my sister genuinely believed I was just a naive, grieving widow who would blindly sign away my future. They forgot exactly what I do for a living. I opened the laptop and the screen illuminated my face with a harsh bright light. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began to type with ruthless precision. I bypassed my personal email and logged directly into the secure financial databases I use for deep corporate audits. I needed to see exactly how much damage they had already done. I pulled my own credit reports using premium institutional software that updates in real time. I ran my social security number and David's social security number through public record aggregators. I watched the progress bar load across the bottom of the screen, my heart pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The system pulled data from banking institutions, credit bureaus, and county recording offices. I knew exactly what to look for. Fraud always leaves a paper trail. People who steal are arrogant, and arrogance makes them sloppy. The first set of reports came back clean. Our checking and savings accounts were untouched. David's tech startup equity was still securely registered. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, but then my eyes caught an anomaly on the second screen. The software flagged a recent hit on my property title. I opened a new tab and navigated directly to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds online portal. My hands were perfectly steady now, driven by pure adrenaline. I typed in the parcel identification number for the house David and I had purchased 3 years ago. This house was our sanctuary. It was the place where we painted the living room together, where we planned to raise our children, where I had spent the last week, sobbing uncontrollably over his sudden death. The search results populated instantly. My eyes locked onto the top line of the registry. There was a brand new lien recorded against the property. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process the information for a brief, agonizing moment. The filing date was Tuesday. David died on Sunday. While I was sitting in the hospital waiting room completely catatonic with shock, arranging to have my beautiful husband's body moved to a funeral home, my parents were apparently at a bank. I clicked the link to download the digital scan of the recorded document. A high-resolution image of a bank loan agreement filled my monitor. It was a home equity line of credit. The amount approved was $250,000. The maximum allowable equity we had built up in our home over the past 3 years. I scrolled down to the signature page. My stomach violently churned. There on the borrower line was my father's signature, Richard Myers. Below his name was the justification for his signature acting as attorney, in fact, for David Sterling. They had used the forged power of attorney, the exact same document Marcus had just brought me to bypass me entirely and borrow $250,000 against my own house. The sheer audacity of their crime stole the breath directly from my lungs. They did not just forge a document to prepare for a future probate battle, they had already weaponized it. They walked into a lending institution, presented a fraudulent legal document bearing a dead man's forged signature, and walked out with $250,000 of our equity. The bank approved it quickly, likely relying on an existing relationship or automated underwriting, assuming a father was handling affairs for his critically ill son-in-law. They drained the financial safety net David and I had worked tirelessly to build, and they did it before he was even placed in the ground. I leaned in closer to the screen, examining the routing details for the loan disbursement. The funds had not been sent to our joint checking account. They had been wired directly into a newly opened external account at a completely different bank, an account I had absolutely no access to. This massive, shocking escalation completely shifted the reality of the conflict. This was no longer just a greedy plot to steal an inheritance down the line. They were actively robbing me in real time. They were draining my current assets to fund whatever twisted lifestyle they felt they deserved. My mother's chilling voice from the accidental voicemail echoed in my mind again. She's too broken to fight us now. They wanted to financially paralyze me by draining the equity from my home and preparing to freeze the startup assets. On Monday morning, they were constructing a cage. They wanted me to wake up next week completely broke, unable to pay the mortgage or hire a competent defense attorney. They assumed that a grieving widow facing sudden immediate poverty would simply surrender everything just to survive. They thought they could starve me out of my own life. I sat back in my leather desk chair, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes. The profound sadness that had defined my existence for the past week was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying absolute focus. My own parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, were actively trying to make me homeless while I was mourning my husband. They had crossed a line so vile, so fundamentally evil, that any remaining sense of familial loyalty I held was instantly incinerated. I looked at the digital timestamp on the loan document again. Tuesday afternoon. My father had sat in a comfortable bank chair, signing a forged name to steal my home while I was picking out a mahogany casket for the man he was impersonating. The betrayal was so deep, it almost felt surreal, like I was reading the details of a true crime documentary instead of my own life. But I was not a helpless victim. I was a senior financial analyst, and they had just handed me a documented federal crime wrapped in a neat little bow. By crossing state lines with wire transfers and defrauding a federally insured financial institution using forged legal documents, they had elevated their greedy family betrayal into severe felony territory. They thought they were playing a simple game of family manipulation. They did not realize they had just walked onto a financial battlefield completely unarmed against a professional. I opened a new encrypted file on my desktop and began meticulously downloading every single piece of evidence. I saved the property title records. I captured the wire transfer routing numbers. I backed up the audio file of my mother's accidental voicemail from David's cloud account, storing it in 3 separate secure locations. I took high-resolution photographs of the crumpled, forged power of attorney Marcus had left on my coffee table. I built an impenetrable digital vault of their crimes, cross-referencing every date, every signature, and every stolen dollar. I worked through the entire night, my mind operating with a cold, mechanical efficiency. I did not feel tired. I did not feel hungry. I only felt the relentless driving need to build a trap so perfectly engineered that they would never see the walls closing in until it was far too late to escape. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window blinds, my forensic portfolio was complete. I had successfully traced their entire fraudulent operation. I knew exactly how much they stole, exactly when they stole it, and exactly how they planned to steal the rest on Monday morning. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving the Chicago streets washed clean and quiet. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I looked at the calendar hanging on the refrigerator. Today was Saturday. I had exactly 48 hours before the courthouse opened on Monday morning. 48 hours before my parents and my sister marched into a legal office to file their fake will and finalize their theft. I had 48 hours to execute a counterattack that would completely obliterate their entire existence. I picked up my phone and scrolled to my contacts. I did not need to cry anymore. I needed to call David's corporate lawyer. The grieving widow was officially dead. The financial analyst was fully awake, and I was ready to absolutely destroy them. Monday morning broke with a harsh, bright sunlight that felt entirely out of place in my shattered world. I had not slept a single minute since Marcus left my house on Saturday night. I spent 36 continuous hours drinking black coffee and building a digital fortress of evidence against my own family. I catalogued every financial discrepancy, every timestamp, and every stolen dollar. When I walked into the sleek glass lobby of Jenkins and Associates downtown, my reflection in the elevator door startled me. The weeping, devastated woman who had collapsed at the cemetery was completely gone. The woman staring back at me wore a tailored navy suit and an expression carved from absolute ice. I marched past the bewildered receptionist and walked directly into the corner office of Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was David's actual corporate attorney. She was a brilliant razor-sharp litigator who had helped my husband secure the federal patents for his software company. She stood up from her heavy oak desk as soon as I entered, her face softening with genuine sympathy. She started to offer her condolences, her voice gentle and warm, but I raised my hand and stopped her before she could even finish the sentence. "I did not come here to mourn," I told her, dropping my heavy leather briefcase directly onto the center of her pristine desk. "I came here to press federal charges." Sarah blinked in surprise, her professional demeanor instantly clicking into gear. She gestured for me to sit down and closed the heavy oak door to her office, ensuring absolute privacy. I did not waste a single second on exposition. I opened my laptop and immediately played the accidental voicemail my mother had left on David's phone during his burial. The audio of my parents and my sister actively plotting to forge David's signature and steal his $5 million company filled the quiet law office. I watched Sarah's face transform as the recording played. The initial shock in her eyes rapidly hardened into a cold, furious glare. When my mother's hissing whisper echoed through the speakers, declaring I was too broken to fight them, Sarah clenched her jaw so tightly I could see the muscle jumping in her cheek. The recording ended, and a suffocating silence settled over the room. Before Sarah could say a single word, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the high-resolution prints of the forged power of attorney that Marcus had confiscated. I slid the papers across the polished mahogany desk. Then I handed her the digital property records I had uncovered on Saturday night. I pointed directly to the $250,000 home equity line of credit my father had secretly taken out against my house using the forged document. They did not just plot to steal the inheritance, I explained, my voice perfectly steady. They already struck. My father sat in a bank on Tuesday afternoon and forged my dead husband's signature to steal $250,000 in home equity. And they plan to file the rest of the forged paperwork at the county courthouse this morning to freeze the tech startup assets before I can even process my grief. I watched Sarah meticulously examine the forged signature. She pulled a pair of reading glasses from her pocket and scrutinized the blue ink and the fraudulent notary stamp. She compared the date on the bank loan to the official medical records I had brought, proving David was entirely incapacitated on life support when this document was supposedly signed. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. My parents were not simply greedy, they were criminally arrogant. They genuinely believed that because I was a grieving widow, I would be entirely blind to their actions. They completely underestimated the fact that I spent 50 hours a week identifying corporate fraud for a living. I told Sarah exactly how I had used my institutional software access to trace the loan disbursement, finding the secret external account my father had opened to hide the stolen funds. Sarah sat back in her chair and removed her glasses. She let out a long, slow breath, tapping her silver pen against the edge of the desk. She looked at me with a profound sense of professional respect. "You did not just uncover a family betrayal, Clara," she said, her voice dropping to a serious, calculated register. "You just handed me a fully documented, completely undeniable federal crime." Sarah leaned forward and opened a secure file on her computer. She began to outline the severe magnitude of the trap my parents had foolishly walked right into. She explained that if they were merely contesting a standard checking account or a family home, this would typically be handled in local civil probate court. The local judges might drag the case out for months, causing massive emotional and financial strain, but it would remain a local civil dispute. However, my parents had made a fatal miscalculation when they decided to target David's tech startup. I listened intently as Sarah pulled up the corporate filings for my husband's company. David's software platform, she explained, holds 3 highly classified federal patents. His company is legally registered as a protected federal entity because of the proprietary algorithms they developed for interstate commerce. By actively forging legal documents to seize controlling equity of a federally protected asset, they have crossed a massive legal boundary. They are attempting to defraud the federal government by proxy. Sarah pointed to the home equity loan documents resting on her desk. Furthermore, the moment your father used that forged signature to extract $250,000 from a federally insured bank and wired those funds across state lines to a hidden account, he committed federal wire fraud. Sarah detailed exactly how the banking system operates. The financial institution my father defrauded was headquartered in New York. The moment the digital transfer was initiated, requesting the release of those funds based on a fraudulent premise, the transaction utilized interstate digital communications. Every single keystroke my father authorized at that bank teller window layered another massive federal charge onto their growing list of felonies. This legally transformed a local forgery case into a multi-count federal wire fraud indictment. The penalties for these actions were not simple fines or a slap on the wrist. We were talking about mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs as I absorbed the immense power of this information. My parents thought they were playing a dirty trick on a vulnerable daughter. They had absolutely no idea they were actively violating federal statutes that carried decades of prison time. The inclusion of the sleazy attorney, making a coordinated plan with my parents and my sister, also triggered federal conspiracy laws. By working together to manufacture fake documents, they had legally formed a criminal enterprise. I looked at Sarah and felt a dangerous, satisfying smile forming on my face. The weeping, heartbroken woman they expected to find was permanently gone. I asked Sarah exactly what we needed to do to ensure they could never escape the consequences of their actions. I told her I did not just want to block their claim. I wanted them to feel the exact same sheer terror and utter devastation they had so willingly inflicted upon me. I wanted to completely dismantle their lives and leave them with absolutely nothing. Sarah's eyes gleamed with a predatory legal focus. She agreed completely. She explained that if we simply filed a police report right now, my parents might manage to secure a plea deal by claiming temporary insanity due to family grief or by throwing their corrupt attorney under the bus. To guarantee a maximum federal sentence, we needed to let them fully commit to the crime on the official record. We needed them to proudly present their forged documents in front of highly credible witnesses and federal investigators. We started drafting a lethal legal trap right there in her office. I explained my mother's psychology to Sarah, detailing how Brenda's arrogance and absolute need for control would make her blind to any red flags. If I played the role of the broken, submissive daughter who just wanted the pain to end, Brenda would eagerly rush to finalize the theft. My grief was still a heavy anchor chained to my soul, but my rage was the raging engine propelling me forward. I sat in that leather chair imagining my mother's fake sympathetic smile, imagining my sister practicing my dead husband's signature. The absolute disrespect for the man who had funded their lives made my blood run entirely cold. I told Sarah that we could not leave a single loophole. I wanted their sleazy lawyer disbarred, and I wanted my family to understand the true cost of treating me like an automated teller machine. Sarah began drafting the preliminary injunctions we would hold in reserve, building an impenetrable wall around David's legacy. This was not just about protecting money. This was about defending my husband's honor against the very people who should have been mourning him alongside me. We devised a strategy to invite them to a formal settlement meeting under the guise of my complete surrender. We would let them believe they had entirely won the war. Every single detail was meticulously planned to exploit their overwhelming greed. By the time I walked out of Sarah's office, the snare was flawlessly set, and my parents were walking directly into a federal prison cell. There was a massive secret I have been keeping from you until this exact moment. While my parents and my sister were scheming in a shady lawyer's office, completely convinced they were outsmarting a grieving widow, they were entirely oblivious to a devastating legal reality. They thought David was just a brilliant software developer who lacked financial common sense. They assumed because he was so generous paying off my father's credit card debts that he was naive. But David built a $5 million technology company from the ground up. He understood complex asset protection better than any corporate litigator. 6 months before his sudden, fatal aneurysm, David and I sat down in this exact corner office with Sarah Jenkins. We did not come here to draft a standard, simple will. David wanted to ensure that our future and his legacy were completely untouchable by anyone who might try to exploit us. During that meeting 6 months ago, David looked at me with profound seriousness. He knew how toxic my parents could be, even if I still tried to see the good in them. He gently explained that my mother Brenda and my father Richard viewed boundaries as personal insults. He worried about what would happen to me if he suddenly passed away. He knew they would instantly swarm like vultures, trying to strip away everything we had painstakingly built. So David proposed a radical, bulletproof financial strategy. Under the meticulous guidance of Sarah Jenkins, we legally transferred every single asset we owned into a highly secure financial vehicle known as an irrevocable blind trust. We legally transferred the deed to our home, the same home my father had just fraudulently borrowed $250,000 against. We also transferred every single share of David's $5 million startup equity. The mechanics of an irrevocable blind trust are absolutely ruthless and legally binding. Once you place an asset inside an irrevocable trust, you legally relinquish direct personal ownership. The trust itself becomes a completely separate legal entity with its own tax identification number. On paper, David Sterling did not own a house. On paper, David Sterling did not own $5 million in corporate equity. The trust owned everything. This meant the forged promissory note my father planned to file on Monday morning, claiming David pledged his company equity as collateral for a phantom loan, was entirely useless. You cannot pledge an asset as collateral if you do not legally own it. Furthermore, the fake holographic will my sister Jessica was forging, claiming David wanted my parents to inherit everything, was legally void. A personal will cannot override the ironclad stipulations of an irrevocable blind trust. But here is the absolute most devastating twist of this entire situation. An irrevocable blind trust requires a named legal executor or trustee to manage and distribute the assets according to the strictly bound terms. David could not name himself, and he deliberately chose not to name me, knowing my parents would employ psychological warfare to manipulate me into signing over my rights. He needed someone completely outside their web of toxic influence. He needed a man of profound, unshakable integrity who would rather die than let Brenda and Richard steal a single dime. Sitting in Sarah's office 6 months ago, David specifically requested that Marcus, my sister, Jessica's husband, be named as the sole legal executor and trustee of our entire estate. Marcus had absolutely no idea. We kept the trust completely confidential, intending to surprise Marcus with the immense responsibility only if an absolute catastrophic emergency ever arose. My heart swelled with overwhelming love for my late husband as Sarah brought the legal documents displaying Marcus' name onto her computer monitor. David had seen the immense fundamental decency in Marcus. He recognized that Marcus was a man who built strong foundations, both as an architect and as a human being. David knew that if my family ever tried to launch a hostile takeover, Marcus would stand like an immovable concrete wall between their greed and my safety. And David was absolutely right. Just 2 nights ago, Marcus had literally stood in the freezing rain holding an umbrella over my head at the cemetery while my own blood relatives abandoned me. He had then driven to my house in the middle of a torrential storm to hand me the forged power of attorney, risking his own marriage to protect a grieving widow. David had brilliantly orchestrated a powerful legal shield from beyond the grave. Sarah Jenkins leaned across her polished mahogany desk, a sharp, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Do you understand exactly what this means, Clara?" she asked, her voice practically humming with electric anticipation. "Your father just used a forged power of attorney to extract a $250,000 home equity line of credit against a property that technically belongs to a protected trust managed entirely by Marcus. When your parents march into the county courthouse on Monday morning to officially file their fake promissory note and their forged holographic, they will not just be making a simple civil error. They will be attempting to forcefully breach an irrevocable trust. The very act of submitting those fabricated documents to a government judge automatically elevates their actions from attempted theft to severe mandatory felony charges. They are actively handing the federal prosecutors a fully wrapped confession perfectly signed. The sheer monumental irony of their situation made a cold, satisfying shiver trace its way down my spine. My mother, Brenda, believed she was an absolute mastermind. She thought she was flawlessly orchestrating a grand financial heist targeting a weak, emotionally destroyed daughter. She truly believed her sinister whisper, "She is too broken to fight us now," was the ultimate winning strategy. She assumed my father could scribble a dead man's name on paper and walk away a millionaire. Instead, they had spent the entire weekend digging their own federal prison cell. Every lie they formulated, every signature Jessica meticulously traced, every dollar Richard fraudulently transferred to his secret bank account served to pull the steel trap tighter around their own necks. They were entirely trapped by their own relentless, unchecked greed and sheer profound stupidity. The legal reality was so beautifully catastrophic for them that I had to take a moment to simply absorb the magnitude of it all. Because Marcus was the legal trustee, my parents could not even attempt to negotiate with me once they realized they were caught. They could not use tears or screaming or guilt trips to force me to drop the charges. I did not have the legal authority to dissolve the trust or forgive the fraud committed against it. Only Marcus held that power, and Marcus had already declared absolute war on their toxic behavior. My parents had unknowingly walked into a heavily fortified bunker, triggered the security alarm, and swallowed the only key. There was absolutely no way out for them anymore. No amount of screaming that we were family would stop the federal investigators from placing cold, heavy metal handcuffs securely around their wrists. I sat in the quiet luxury of Sarah's office, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the absolute destruction of my parents' impending future. I thought about the garbage bags, sitting on the front porch when I was 13 years old. I thought about my mother standing in the doorway, looking at me like I was a problem she was thrilled to finally discard. I thought about the endless years I spent desperately trying to buy their love by paying off their debts and funding their extravagant demands. I had sacrificed my own peace for decades just to maintain the fragile illusion of a family. But the brutal abandonment at the cemetery had finally snapped the last remaining thread of my delusion. I owed them absolutely nothing. I was fully prepared to watch them lose everything they valued. Their reputation, their freedom, and their completely unearned sense of superiority were about to brutally, systematically vanish. Sarah pulled a fresh legal pad toward her. "We need to let them execute their final move," she instructed. "If we confront them now, they will simply destroy the forged documents and claim the bank loan was a misunderstanding. To secure a maximum federal indictment, we must allow them to formally present their fraudulent claims on the official public record." I nodded my mind, racing ahead to the trap we were about to spring. I would call my mother today. I would play the exact part she originally assigned to me. I would be the broken, sobbing widow who simply could not handle the immense stress of legal probate. I would beg her to just help. I would lead them directly into the grand boardroom of David's company and let them present their forged crimes to an audience of federal investigators. The grieving widow was dead, but the financial analyst was about to deliver a brutal reckoning. I drove directly from Sarah Jenkins' office to an electronics store in downtown Chicago. I did not want to rely on the standard home security system my parents already knew about. I needed something entirely discreet, something they would never look twice at. I purchased 3 high-definition hidden cameras. One was embedded inside a digital clock. Another was disguised as a standard phone charger. The third was built into a decorative picture frame. Back at my quiet house, I spent 2 hours meticulously positioning them. I angled the digital clock camera directly toward the large velvet sofa where my mother preferred to sit. I placed the picture frame camera on the mantel, giving it an unobstructed, sweeping view of the coffee table. I tested the audio feeds, connecting them to a secure cloud server. The microphones were incredibly sensitive, picking up even the softest sigh. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a director setting the stage for a performance that would ultimately lock my family in federal prison. I knew Brenda and Jessica would not wait long. They thought I was drowning in sorrow and desperately needed to capitalize on my vulnerability before the weekend ended. I made myself a cup of black tea and waited in the center of the perfectly framed trap. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. I took a deep breath, forcing the cold, analytical fury down into my chest. I needed to channel every ounce of exhaustion I had felt at the cemetery. I let my shoulders slump and rubbed my eyes until they were bloodshot. I walked to the door and pulled it open. Brenda and Jessica were standing on the porch holding aluminum foil-covered casserole dishes. They wore identical expressions of rehearsed tragic sympathy. "Oh, my sweet girl." Brenda cooed immediately, stepping into the foyer and wrapping her free arm around my shoulders. "We could not bear the thought of you sitting in this big house all by yourself. We brought baked ziti." Jessica followed right behind her, wearing a designer sweater and looking around the house with greedy, calculating eyes. "We are here for you, Clara," Jessica added softly, placing her dish on the entryway table. "We are going to handle everything so you do not have to worry." It took immense physical restraint not to slam the door in their faces. Instead, I let out a trembling sob and leaned into my mother, allowing her to guide me into the living room directly into the high-resolution focus of the digital clock camera. They sat exactly where I wanted them. Brenda took the center cushion of the velvet sofa, while Jessica settled into the armchair beside the coffee table. I sat opposite them, holding a crumpled tissue, pretending to wipe away tears. They offered to heat up the food. I shook my head, playing the part of a woman entirely hollowed out by loss. For 20 minutes, they put on a spectacular show. Brenda talked about how much she loved David, squeezing out fake tears, recounting a completely fabricated memory of him. Jessica nodded along, patting my knee and telling me that time heals all wounds. If I had not heard that accidental voicemail, I might have believed they actually cared. I watched the digital clock blinking on the side table, knowing its hidden lens was capturing every single lie. Then the tone of the room subtly shifted. Brenda let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and reached into her oversized purse. "You know, Clara," she began, her voice dropping to a comforting register. "I hate to bring up practical matters at a time like this, but your father and I want to protect you from the ugly side of losing a spouse." I sniffled loudly and looked up at her, blinking through my fake tears. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking perfectly. Brenda pulled a thick manila folder from her bag and laid it on the coffee table right in front of the picture frame camera. "The probate process is an absolute nightmare," Clara Jessica chimed in, leaning forward with deep concern. "The government steps in and freezes everything. They tie up your assets in court for months, sometimes years. We just do not want to see you lose this beautiful house to greedy tax collectors while you are trying to grieve." Brenda nodded, solemnly tapping the folder. "Your father spoke with a kind tax consultant this morning. We figured out a way to shield the house from probate entirely. It is just a routine tax document, a temporary transfer that puts the property into our names for a few months until the estate is settled. That way the courts cannot touch it. Once everything clears, we transfer it right back to you. You are entirely too broken to handle complex paperwork right now. Let us carry this weight for you." I stared at the folder. They were utterly ruthless, using my husband's death to steal my home. I reached out with trembling hands and slowly opened the folder. Inside was a clean legal document with sticky notes pointing to the signature lines. I did not need to read the fine print to know exactly what it was. It was a quitclaim deed. It was a binding legal instrument that would instantly surrender all my ownership rights, transferring them directly to Richard and Brenda permanently. They had completely omitted the fact that my father had already used a forged power of attorney to extract a $250,000 loan against this very same property. They were trying to secure the deed so I could never dispute the fraudulent loan. I let out a loud, agonizing wail and buried my face in my hands. "I cannot do this," I sobbed, rocking back and forth on the couch. "I cannot look at legal papers. It is all too much. I just want David back. I cannot handle this." Brenda quickly slid over to my side, rubbing my back with one hand while eagerly pushing a blue ink pen toward me with the other. "I know, sweetheart. I know," she whispered soothingly. "You do not have to read it. Just sign at the bottom and we will take care of the rest." I kept my head down, hiding the cold, satisfying smirk fighting its way onto my face. I took a deep, shaky breath and picked up the blue pen. I am naturally right-handed. My parents know this. Jessica knows this. But I deliberately transferred the pen to my left hand. My fingers hovered over the thick black line at the bottom of the quitclaim deed. I let out one final pathetic sniffle, making sure my face was clearly visible to the camera on the mantel. "I am just so tired," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Thank you for taking care of me." With my left hand, I slowly, awkwardly dragged the pen across the paper. I intentionally butchered the signature. It looked like a child had scribbled my name with their eyes closed. The letters were jagged, uneven, and completely mismatched from my actual legal signature. It was an absolute mess, even if this document somehow made it to a judge without triggering the federal wire fraud traps. I had said the signature itself would easily be proven completely invalid by any basic handwriting expert. But my mother and sister were so blinded by their greed, they did not even notice which hand I was using. They were practically vibrating with excitement. Brenda snatched the document off the table the absolute second the pen lifted from the paper. She quickly checked the signature line completely, ignoring the jagged handwriting, and shoved the deed back into her manila folder. "There you go, Clara," she said, her voice suddenly much brisker, more businesslike. "That is one less thing for you to worry about. We will get this filed first thing on Monday morning, so you are completely protected." Jessica stood up, smoothing her designer sweater. She smiled, a genuine bright smile that made my stomach churn. "You should go lie down, Clara. We are going to head out and let you rest. You really look terrible. We will handle the heavy lifting from here." They did not even stay to heat up the casseroles they brought. The baked ziti was just a prop, a cheap excuse to get through my front door. They walked back into the foyer, practically skipping with victory. I followed them, moving slowly, playing the exhausted victim right to the very end. I leaned against the doorframe, watching them hurry down the walkway to their car. They thought they had just secured $1 million property from a helpless crying widow. They had no idea they had just sealed their own fate permanently. I closed the heavy oak door and locked the deadbolt securely. The lock clicked and the trembling stopped. Tears dried. I stood straight, rolling my shoulders, releasing the tension of their twisted game. I walked calmly back into the living room and went straight to my laptop. I pulled up the secure cloud server where the hidden cameras were feeding their data. The footage was absolutely breathtaking. The 4K resolution captured every single detail with devastating clarity. I pressed play and watched the last 30 minutes unfold. On the screen, exactly as planned. The audio was pristine. I heard my mother explicitly lie, calling a permanent quitclaim deed a temporary routine tax document. I heard her promise to transfer the house back to me, proving fraudulent intent and deliberate manipulation. I watched her literally push the pen into my hand while I was pretending to be emotionally incapacitated. I zoomed in on the footage from the picture frame camera. It perfectly captured the moment I signed the paper, holding the pen in my left hand, purposely creating a fake signature while under intense psychological duress orchestrated by my own family. It was a masterpiece of evidence. Any federal prosecutor would take one look at this video and immediately secure a grand jury indictment for fraud, coercion, and elder abuse equivalents. They had handed me the final nail in their coffin. I downloaded the files, encrypting them and sending copies to Sarah Jenkins' secure portal. The trap was now fully armed. The bait had been taken. My parents and my sister thought Monday morning would be their ultimate victory. They thought they would walk into the county courthouse and seize my entire life. They did not realize that I had already built a federal case that would completely destroy their world. I closed my laptop and looked around my house. I was ready. Monday was coming, and justice was going to be absolutely merciless. I smiled in the quiet darkness, knowing the very people who abandoned me at the cemetery were about to lose their freedom forever. Everything was perfectly aligned. Monday morning arrived with a cold gray light bleeding through my living room blinds. I had been awake since Saturday night, functioning on nothing but black coffee and pure unadulterated adrenaline. The trap was meticulously set, but it needed the final piece of bait to be executed perfectly. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at my mobile phone resting on the marble countertop. It was exactly 8 in the morning. My parents and my sister would be wide awake right now, eagerly plotting their trip to the county courthouse. I needed to intercept them before they filed the forged promissory note and the fake holographic will through standard channels. If they simply filed those fraudulent documents without my physical presence, it would initiate a lengthy bureaucratic paperwork dispute. I needed them in a room. I needed them to hand those forged documents directly to me and my legal team on the official record. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold clinical precision of my profession completely overriding my lingering grief. I opened the voice recording application on my encrypted work laptop and synced it directly to my phone. Every single syllable of this upcoming conversation was going to be securely logged and sent immediately to Sarah Jenkins. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I needed to sound exactly like a woman who was absolutely drowning in sorrow. A woman who had spent the entire weekend staring at the walls, completely paralyzed by the devastating loss of her husband. I pictured David. I pictured his empty chair at the dining table and his jacket still hanging by the front door. The tears came easily to my eyes, but they were no longer tears of despair or heartbreak. They were tears of pure, focused wrath. I tapped my mother's contact name on the screen and put the phone on speaker mode. The phone rang once. It rang twice. On the third ring, the line clicked open. "Clara." My mother's voice floated through the speaker, dripping with that sickening artificial sweetness she exclusively reserved for her most manipulative moments. "Good morning, sweetheart," she cooed. "We were just getting ready to head out and run some very important errands for you." I knew exactly what those errands were. They were heading downtown to steal my $5 million estate and secure the fraudulent lien against my house. I let out a long, trembling sob directly into the receiver. I made sure it sounded utterly pathetic, completely devoid of any remaining fight or spirit. "Mom," I gasped, my voice cracking with practiced perfection. "Mom, I simply cannot do this anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and profound. I could almost hear the gears rapidly turning in my mother's head as she calculated this sudden dramatic shift in my demeanor. "Clara, honey, what is wrong?" Brenda asked, her voice lowering into a hushed, soothing tone that made my skin physically crawl. "You sound absolutely terrible. Did you manage to sleep at all last night?" I let out another ragged breath, pressing my free hand against my forehead to maintain the physical sensation of severe distress. "No," I wept loudly. "I did not sleep. I cannot sleep at all. I have been sitting here in the dark looking at all these massive financial papers David left behind. There are so many complicated documents, Mum." I cried, leaning closer to the microphone. "There are corporate accounts and startup equity portfolios and federal patent registries. I do not understand any of this legal jargon. It is entirely too much for me to process. I just want my husband back. I cannot handle this terrifying legal nightmare alone." I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other side of the line. I knew with absolute certainty that my father and my sister were likely standing right next to her, listening to every single word on speakerphone. "Oh, my poor sweet baby Brenda," cooed her voice thick with fake maternal concern. "I told you the probate process is a complete nightmare. It is ruthlessly designed to crush grieving families. That is exactly why your father and I stepped in to help you with the house paperwork on Saturday. We simply hate seeing you suffer like this. We want to protect you." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, my knuckles turning bone-wide under the pressure. "Yes," I stammered, acting completely overwhelmed and deeply grateful. "Thank you so much for doing that for me. But Mom, there is so much more than just the house. The tech startup company, the corporate equity, the business accounts. The lawyers are going to freeze everything we own. They are going to drag me into a courtroom for months or even years. I cannot sit in a cold courtroom and fight over David's money. Every single time I look at a legal document, I feel like I'm going to have a massive panic attack. I just want the pain to stop right now. I want to walk away from all of it." I paused deliberately, letting the heavy silence stretch across the phone line, allowing my mother to fully absorb the absolute total surrender in my voice. "Mom." I continued my voice, dropping to a fragile, desperate whisper. "I want you and Dad to take it. I want you to take all of it." "Clara, what exactly are you saying?" Brenda asked. Her voice was suddenly completely devoid of its fake sympathetic warmth. It was incredibly sharp, alert, and ravenously hungry. "I am saying I want to sign everything over to you," I sobbed, pushing the theatrical performance to its absolute limit. "You and Dad always knew how to handle complex business matters. You always knew how to manage massive finances. David always told me he owed you so much for welcoming him into our family. He would deeply want you to have it. I just want to sign the rights over to you today so I do not have to deal with the courts or the ruthless lawyers or the federal patent offices ever again. If I give you the full legal authority over the entire $5 million estate, will you please just make this horrible nightmare go away from me?" The silence that followed was the loudest, deafening silence I have ever experienced in my entire life. I could vividly picture my mother standing in her kitchen, her eyes wide with unchecked, predatory greed. She had been meticulously preparing to forge documents and fight a messy, drawn-out legal battle. Now I was willingly offering her the keys to the entire financial kingdom without a single ounce of resistance. She was an absolute raging narcissist, and her immense arrogance completely blinded her to any possibility that this could be a calculated trap. She genuinely believed her emotional abuse had broken me perfectly. "Oh, Clara," Brenda finally said, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement, perfectly disguised as heavy maternal duty. "If that is truly what you want, we will carry this massive burden for you. We just want to protect you, sweetheart. Your father and I will take over the entire estate immediately. We will manage the startup equity and deal with the aggressive courts so you can just focus entirely on your healing." "Thank you," I cried, making my voice sound incredibly weak and profoundly relieved. "Thank you so much, Mom. But I need to do it today. I need to get this over with immediately before I completely lose my mind. Can we just meet right now and sign whatever legal forms I need to sign to transfer the $5 million directly into your name? I want to do it properly. I do not want the state to have any reason to come after me later for tax issues." Yes, of course," Brenda replied quickly, her words tumbling over each other. Her greedy mind was clearly racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. "We absolutely need to do this by the book to ensure the courts do not interfere with the transfer. Your father and I have actually been consulting with a very experienced corporate attorney, a wonderful professional man. He knows exactly how to expedite these kinds of complex transfers to protect family assets from probate. We should have a formal legal meeting today to finalize the transfer of the startup equity and all the remaining property rights. I felt a cold, triumphant smile spread slowly across my face. She was taking the bait so deeply she was practically swallowing the entire fishing rod. A formal meeting, I repeated, acting slightly hesitant and fearful. Do we really need scary lawyers involved, Mom? I just want to sign the papers and be done with it. I do not want to go to an intimidating law office. No, sweetheart. Brenda insisted, her tone taking on a commanding, authoritative edge that brooked no argument. We absolutely must have our attorney present to make it officially binding. We have to ensure the legal paperwork is completely airtight so the tech company board cannot ever challenge your decision. We will make it very comfortable for you. We can meet at his private office downtown at noon. You just have to show up and sign the transfer documents. We will handle all the heavy lifting. I promise you will feel so much better once this massive financial weight is legally lifted off your shoulders. I squeezed my eyes shut, relishing the absolute sheer stupidity of her overwhelming greed. She was so completely blinded by the prospect of securing $5 million legally that she was willingly, actively inviting her corrupt attorney into the dead center of a federal fraud investigation. She thought she was masterfully maneuvering me into a corner. In reality, she was proudly marching her entire criminal enterprise directly into a federal slaughterhouse. Mom, I sniffled, maintaining the helpless charade. I really do not want to go to a strange lawyer's office today. It feels too cold and corporate. Can we please just meet at David's corporate office? The big executive boardroom is completely empty today. It feels much more respectful to do it there, where he built everything. Please, Mom, I just want to sit in his beautiful boardroom one last time before I hand the entire company over to you and Dad forever. Brenda hesitated for a fraction of a second. I knew she would vastly prefer the safety and control of her sleazy lawyer's private office, but the prospect of sitting in the grand executive boardroom of the multi-million-dollar company she was about to steal was simply too much for her massive ego to resist. She desperately wanted to play the role of the conquering queen taking over her dead son-in-law's empire. That is a beautiful idea, Clara. She agreed, her voice dripping with toxic artificial sentimentality. We will meet you at David's corporate boardroom exactly at noon. I will personally bring our attorney and all the necessary transfer documents. You do not need to bring anything at all except yourself. We will take care of our little girl. I thanked her profusely, praising her for being such a wonderful, incredibly supportive mother during my darkest hour. I listened to her utter a few more empty platitudes before the call finally disconnected. The line went completely dead, and the profound silence rushed back into my kitchen. I lowered the phone and let out a long, slow, measured breath. The emotional transformation was absolutely instantaneous. The weeping, broken widow vanished completely, replaced by a woman constructed of pure, unyielding steel. I looked directly at the recording application on my laptop. The audio file had flawlessly captured every single second of the damning conversation. I immediately saved the file, encrypted it with a complex password, and sent it directly to Sarah Jenkins' secure legal server. I had just successfully recorded my own mother officially confirming her explicit intent to use a corrupt attorney to orchestrate the immediate transfer of a federally protected $5 million asset through extreme psychological manipulation and coordinated fraud. I stood up from the kitchen island and walked over to the large bay window looking out at the quiet street. The relentless rain had finally stopped, but the morning sky remained a heavy, bruised gray. I thought about the staggering sheer volume of lies my family had effortlessly spun over the past week. I thought about how easily and naturally my mother slipped into the role of the deeply caring matriarch while actively, systematically plotting my total financial ruin. It was a terrifying, chilling realization to fully understand that the people who raised you possess absolutely zero moral compass. For 28 years, I had constantly questioned my own sanity and worth. Whenever my mother treated me with cold, brutal indifference, or my father actively prioritized Jessica's frivolous, superficial desires over my basic fundamental needs, I always internalized the deep blame. I convinced myself that I was simply not trying hard enough to be a good, acceptable daughter. I spent my entire adult life desperately trying to earn their elusive love by offering endless financial bailouts and maintaining a stance of silent, absolute compliance. But that recorded phone call was the ultimate final validation of my true reality. I was not the fundamental problem in this family. I had never been the problem. They were completely broken, empty, parasitic people who viewed all human relationships purely as transactional financial opportunities. When my mother heard my fake, agonizing sobs, she did not hear a grieving daughter in profound pain. She heard a glaring vulnerability she could immediately, ruthlessly exploit. When I offered to completely surrender my dead husband's entire legacy, she did not stop to question why a young widow would make such a drastic, completely irrational legal decision. She only saw a massive life-changing payday. Her mind instantly bypassed any shred of maternal instinct and went straight to the cold logistics of securing the theft. She even proudly insisted on bringing the corrupt attorney, validating the formal conspiracy charge we needed for the impending federal indictment. They were also perfectly, tragically predictable in their absolute wretched greed. I walked back into my home office and opened my large closet. I needed to select the absolute perfect outfit for this midday meeting. I quickly bypassed the dark, somber morning clothes I had worn for the past few miserable days. I reached into the back and pulled out a sharp-tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the exact suit I wore when I was presenting highly complex financial forensic audits to aggressive corporate boards. It was the literal armor of a woman who commanded heavy rooms and systematically dismantled fraudulent financial systems for a living. I laid the suit carefully on the bed and began to prepare my leather briefcase. I did not need to pack any legal transfer documents today. Sarah Jenkins was handling all the meticulous legal paperwork required for the trap. But I did pack my work laptop, the secure external hard drive containing the hidden 4K camera footage, and the printed, highlighted copies of the forged home equity loan documents my father had signed. I thought about Marcus as I packed my bag. He was the silent, unsung hero of this entire massive operation. If he had not discovered that forged power of attorney hidden in Jessica's purse, I would have walked into this week completely blind to their devastating attack. David had been so incredibly wise to name Marcus as the blind trust executor. David understood deeply that true family is not defined by shared blood or genetics. It is defined by the courageous people who stand firmly in front of you when the starving wolves come circling. Marcus had proven his absolute loyalty not just to David's memory, but to fundamental human decency and justice. He was completely willing to detonate his own marriage to stop a devastating legal injustice against me. As I buttoned my crisp white blouse, I felt a profound, immense sense of gratitude for the family I had consciously chosen, rather than the highly toxic family I was unfortunately born into. I checked my silver watch. It was exactly 10:30 in the morning. I had 90 minutes before the final showdown in the executive boardroom. 90 minutes before Brenda, Richard, Jessica, and their exceptionally sleazy lawyer walked into a secure room completely expecting to conquer an empire. I vividly pictured the elegant layout of David's corporate office, the massive glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. It was a beautiful, intimidating space designed for high-level corporate negotiations and massive financial victories. It was the absolute perfect stage for the total, catastrophic destruction of their criminal enterprise. They thought they were coming downtown to collect a pathetic surrender. They had absolutely no idea they were confidently walking straight into an inescapable federal snare that had been meticulously engineered by a senior financial analyst and a ruthless corporate litigator. I picked up my briefcase and walked to the front door ready to deliver absolute ruin. The drive into downtown Chicago on Monday morning felt like a journey into an entirely different dimension. The relentless, violent rain from the long weekend had finally cleared, leaving the city skyline gleaming sharply against a pale blue sky. I sat quietly in the back of a private car, watching the towering glass and steel structures pass by my tinted window. My mind was completely empty of sorrow. It was a perfectly organized filing cabinet of ruthless strategy and flawless execution. I was wearing my sharpest, darkest charcoal gray suit, the exact one that made me feel entirely untouchable during hostile corporate audits. I arrived at the massive corporate headquarters of David's technology company exactly at 9 in the morning. While sees, walking through the sweeping, towering, revolving doors of the grand lobby brought a sudden, sharp physical ache to my chest, but I pushed it down instantly, crushing it under a wall of cold logic. This was the brilliant empire my beautiful genius husband had built from absolutely nothing. This was the sacred professional space where he had spent countless exhausting hours coding complex algorithms and building a beautiful, secure future for us. And this was the exact place my greedy, narcissistic mother, Brenda, truly thought she was going to casually, systematically steal today. I approached the sleek, polished marble security desk and presented my official credentials. The guards all recognized me immediately. They offered their quiet, deeply respectful condolences and handed me the master access keycard for the secure executive floor. I rode the private glass elevator up to the highest level, my reflection staring back at me cold, hard, and absolutely resolute. I stepped out onto the executive floor, and the profound, heavy silence of the building completely wrapped around me. I walked directly down the long main corridor past the rows of empty, quiet offices and sleek, modern workspaces until I reached the grand boardroom at the very end of the hall. I swiped my keycard and pushed the heavy, frosted glass doors wide open. The room was an absolute stunning masterpiece of corporate power and severe intimidation. It featured a massive polished mahogany table that could easily, comfortably seat 20 top-level executives. The walls were elegantly lined with seamless high-definition digital presentation screens and very expensive contemporary art pieces that David had personally selected. But the absolute most striking feature was the towering floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows that offered a breathtaking, completely unobstructed view of the entire sprawling city. I had specifically deliberately chosen this exact room for a very precise, calculated psychological reason. Brenda is a toxic woman completely constantly driven by fake status and fragile ego. She desperately craves unearned wealth and the grand illusion of immense power over others. By bringing her into this incredible, intimidating space, I was actively feeding her absolute ultimate fantasy. She would boldly walk into this grand boardroom, look out at the sprawling, wealthy city, and feel exactly like a conquering, victorious queen finally taking her rightful throne. Her massive, unchecked ego would completely blind her to any hidden lethal dangers, making her incredibly careless and dangerously overly confident. I desperately wanted her to feel completely invincible, right up until the exact microsecond the entire floor gave way beneath her. I walked slowly to the head of the long mahogany table and carefully, deliberately placed my heavy leather briefcase down. I spent the next 20 full minutes arranging the physical space with meticulous clinical precision. I dragged 4 thick, heavy leather chairs and positioned them exactly opposite the specific spot where I would be sitting. I intensely wanted Brenda, Richard, Jessica, and their sleazy, arrogant attorney to be perfectly aligned in a single tight row like suspects in a police lineup. This specific strategic arrangement would force them to constantly look directly at me across the vast, intimidating expanse of the table, giving them absolutely no place to hide their greedy, shifting expressions. At exactly 9:30, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Sarah Jenkins, my ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney, walked in carrying a massive, heavy box of perfectly organized legal files. But Sarah was definitely not alone. Behind her walked 3 tall men and 1 sharp woman, all wearing highly tailored dark suits and carrying heavy black tactical equipment cases. Their sudden commanding presence immediately shifted the entire atmosphere of the room from a quiet corporate meeting space to an active, highly dangerous federal operation. Sarah walked right up to me and introduced the serious team with a sharp professional nod. These are special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Unit, she stated, her voice dropping to a low, very serious register. Alongside them are 2 senior investigators from the State Corporate Fraud Division. I firmly shook hands with the lead federal agent, a tall, heavily imposing man with sharp graying hair and absolute focused intensity in his cold eyes. He quietly explained that Sarah had contacted his specific unit late Saturday night, directly forwarding the comprehensive digital portfolio of undeniable evidence I had meticulously assembled. The federal agents had spent their entire Sunday actively reviewing the 4K hidden camera footage of my toxic family coercing me into signing the fraudulent quitclaim deed. They had officially verified the forged signatures on the $250,000 home equity loan using specialized forensic software. They had successfully tracked the illegal interstate wire transfers my father foolishly initiated to his secret newly opened offshore bank account. The lead agent looked at me with a complex mixture of deep professional respect and genuine human sympathy. He told me that in his 20 long years of investigating corporate espionage and high-level financial crimes, he had rarely ever seen such a brazen, perfectly documented case of familial fraud. He assured me with absolute certainty that my parents had blindly crossed so many massive federal legal boundaries that their aggressive prosecution was an absolute undeniable certainty. The strict mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud forgery and criminal conspiracy across state lines using a federally protected technology company as leverage meant my parents were looking at multiple decades behind heavy iron bars. There would be absolutely zero plea deals offered today. We smoothly moved into the logistical, tactical phase of the massive operation. The grand boardroom was structurally designed for high-level corporate transparency, but it happily possessed one specific architectural feature that made it the absolute perfect location for our devastating trap. Directly adjacent to the main huge boardroom, separated by a thick wall of soundproof one-way mirrored glass, was a smaller private executive observation suite. During normal daily business operations, this secure room was used for live translation services or highly secure administrative monitoring during massive corporate mergers. Today, it would serve as the ultimate hidden federal observation deck. I quietly watched as the state fraud investigators and the federal agents carried their heavy black equipment cases directly into the adjoining glass office. They carefully lowered the electronic privacy blinds, leaving just a tiny, completely undetectable fraction of an inch open for their high-resolution camera lenses. The lead agent explained their exact operating protocol. They were setting up state-of-the-art, highly sensitive directional audio receivers that would flawlessly capture every single whisper, every nervous breath, and every desperate lie my family brought into the boardroom. They were tapping directly into the existing corporate security camera feeds to actively ensure multiple high-definition angles of the impending confrontation were recorded simultaneously. They wanted to capture the exact undeniable moment my family formally presented the forged legal documents on the official public record. Sarah and I sat quietly at the mahogany table, reviewing the final lethal details of the legal trap. We repeatedly rehearsed the exact specific sequence of events that needed to flawlessly unfold. I had to expertly maintain the fragile, terrified, weeping, grieving widow persona perfectly without breaking character. I needed to let Brenda do absolutely all the talking. I needed to let their sleazy lawyer proudly, aggressively lay out his fraudulent financial plan. Sarah explicitly instructed me to simply nod silently and ask basic clarifying questions that would gently force them to verbally confirm their criminal intent on the active federal recording. We desperately needed the lawyer to explicitly state on tape that the backdated promissory note and the forged handwritten holographic will were authentic, genuine documents. We needed Brenda to aggressively, impatiently push me to permanently sign over the $5 million trust assets. The federal agents, sitting silently in the dark room behind the mirrored glass, would be monitoring the entire conversation in real time, wearing specialized communication headsets. They carefully instructed us that once the fraudulent documents were physically placed on the table and verbally authenticated by the corrupt attorney, the massive crime of attempted federal fraud would be fully, irrevocably, completely committed. At that exact defining moment, Sarah would simply stand up and walk slowly toward the one-way glass. That simple physical movement would be the final catastrophic signal for the agents to enter. I stood up from the heavy table and walked toward the massive panoramic windows looking out over the sprawling, beautiful Chicago skyline. The massive city looked vast and completely indifferent to the immense human drama about to forcefully unfold in this room. My heart pounded a slow, heavy, steady rhythm against my ribs. I felt a strange, profound, completely unexpected sense of absolute pure peace settling over my entire physical body. For 28 long, miserable years, I had actively let these awful people tear me down. I had silently absorbed their constant brutal criticism, their endless greedy demands, and their vicious, highly manipulative lies. I had helplessly watched them completely prioritize my selfish, entitled sister while treating me exactly like a disposable automated asset. I had foolishly sacrificed my own personal joy just to desperately keep their toxic, twisted version of peace. But today, that entire exhausting lifetime of silent submission was officially, permanently over. I was going to ruthlessly use the exact same financial intelligence and cold corporate logic that David so deeply, fiercely admired in me to dismantle my family completely and thoroughly. I turned around slowly and looked at the 4 empty leather chairs waiting silently for them. The grand boardroom was completely, entirely silent, except for the faint, low hum of the federal recording equipment warming up behind the thick glass wall. At exactly 11:45, Sarah Jenkins took her seat calmly next to me at the head of the massive table. She opened a sleek, dark leather portfolio and neatly arranged a thick stack of blank legal documents, perfectly, flawlessly mimicking the appearance of a standard corporate estate transfer. She placed a heavy silver pen, very deliberately, right in the center of the table. We sat together in the quiet, massive, intimidating room, the heavy tension building heavily with every single passing second. The lead federal agent stepped out of the hidden dark observation room one final time. He looked directly at Sarah and then looked straight at me. The audio feeds are perfectly live, and the cameras are officially rolling. He stated, his voice incredibly calm and deeply authoritative. We have full, complete coverage of the entire room from 4 angles. We will absolutely not interfere until the fraudulent documents are officially formally presented and the illegal money transfer is explicitly demanded. You are entirely, completely in control of this room, Clara. Do not let them intimidate you for a single second. He gave me a single, highly reassuring nod before stepping back quickly into the deep shadows of the adjoining office and sealing the heavy, thick, soundproof door tightly shut behind him. The grand stage was now perfectly, flawlessly set. The lethal trap was flawlessly constructed and fully, completely armed. The seasoned federal agents were practically entirely invisible, watching silently from the total darkness. My brilliant, ruthless legal counsel was sitting calmly right by my side, ready to completely, utterly destroy their incredibly corrupt, arrogant attorney. And I was sitting tall at the head of the massive empire, my dead husband beautifully built, wearing my dark corporate armor, ready to deliver absolute, utter, complete ruin. I folded my hands calmly on the cool, polished mahogany wood and stared directly at the heavy, thick, frosted glass doors at the very end of the incredibly long room. In exactly 10 short minutes, Brenda, Richard, Jessica, and their incredibly foolish, arrogant lawyer would walk eagerly through those doors, completely expecting to instantly claim a massive $5 million prize from a weak, crying, devastated daughter. They had absolutely zero idea they were confidently walking straight into a fully coordinated, lethal federal sting operation. I took one final deep, calming breath, letting the warm, beautiful memory of David's kind, bright smile fuel my cold, hard, unyielding, absolute rage. I was finally completely ready for them. I sat perfectly still at the head of the massive polished mahogany table. The surface of the wood was so incredibly pristine, it reflected the pale blue morning sky from the towering panoramic windows. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, forcing my breathing to remain shallow and irregular. I had to look like a woman on the absolute verge of a complete mental collapse. At exactly 12 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors at the far end of the grand boardroom swung wide open. My mother, Brenda, marched into the room first. She was dripping with unearned arrogance and absolute sickening confidence. She wore a brand new, crisp, white designer suit that undoubtedly cost thousands of dollars. It was a suit she had likely purchased using the stolen funds from the fraudulent home equity loan my father took out just days ago. Richard followed closely behind her. He walked with a puffed-out chest, trying desperately to look like a seasoned corporate titan taking over his rightful empire instead of a failed mechanic stealing from his dead son-in-law. My older sister Jessica sauntered in next. She was holding a ridiculously expensive handbag and wearing dark, oversized sunglasses indoors. She pulled the glasses down and looked around the sprawling, glass-walled executive sanctuary with wide, ravenously hungry eyes. She actually reached out and ran her manicured fingers over the expensive contemporary art pieces hanging on the walls, calculating their auction value in her head. Finally, their deeply corrupt private attorney brought up the rear. He wore a slick, dark pinstripe suit and carried a thick, bulging leather briefcase. He looked around the room with a cold, predatory smirk, completely convinced he was the smartest man in the building. They strutted into David's beautiful, pristine corporate sanctuary, absolutely radiating unchecked greed. They treated the entire space like it was their personal, newly conquered kingdom. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly onto a heavily monitored federal stage. Brenda immediately spotted me sitting alone at the end of the long table. She rushed forward, the sharp heels of her new shoes clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "Oh, my poor sweet damaged Clara," she cooed, throwing her arms around my stiff, rigid shoulders in a suffocating, highly theatrical hug. "I am so incredibly proud of you for having the sheer courage to do this today. I know just sitting in his office must be absolutely tearing your fragile little heart into a million pieces." She kissed the top of my head, and the cloying smell of her expensive perfume made my stomach physically churn. Jessica walked over and patted my arm, offering a perfectly rehearsed, pathetic pout. "You look entirely exhausted, Clara. You look completely drained. Do not worry about a single heavy thing today. We are going to take all this ugly, complicated legal stress completely away from you so you can just go back to bed and cry." Richard did not even bother offering a single word of fake comfort. He bypassed me entirely and walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling Chicago skyline. He stood there, rubbing his greedy hands together, exactly like a man who believed he suddenly owned the entire city. The lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly to command the room. He placed his heavy, bulging briefcase directly onto the exact center of the polished mahogany table, right where I needed it to be, perfectly within the frame of the hidden cameras. He popped the heavy golden latches and pulled out a massive, towering stack of legal documents. He slapped the heavy pile of forged claims down onto the wood with a loud, solid, resonating thud. "Clara," he said, his voice slick with extreme predatory confidence, "I am Attorney Vance. Your parents have officially retained my legal services to facilitate this incredibly complex financial transition. We are going to make this legal process as fast and painless as possible for you today." I looked down at the massive stack of paper resting on the table. The very top page clearly, boldly displayed the forged, backdated promissory note, explicitly claiming David owed my father millions of dollars in phantom startup seed money. Right beneath it, I could see the edge of the completely fabricated, handwritten holographic will that my sister had spent her entire weekend meticulously tracing. I forced my eyes to well up with fake, terrified tears. "I just want this all to be way over," I whispered, making my voice tremble and crack perfectly. "I cannot even bear to look at these massive legal papers. It is just way too much for my broken brain to process." Brenda quickly pulled a heavy leather chair out and sat down right next to me, leaning in uncomfortably close. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice dropping to a sickeningly sweet, highly manipulative, maternal register. "That is exactly why your family is stepping in right now. David was a brilliant boy, but he was so incredibly disorganized and foolish with his personal finances. He came to your father and me so many times over the years, literally begging for business advice and emergency financial support. We quietly funded this entire company when it was just a tiny, struggling dream in his garage. You know exactly how much he struggled, Clara. You know how much he desperately relied on us to keep him completely afloat." I sat there in total, absolute silence, listening to my own mother completely, flawlessly rewrite the history of my brilliant, hardworking husband. David had never asked them for a single solitary dime. He had selflessly paid off their massive credit card debts. He had quietly funded their lavish, entitled lifestyles for years. And now Brenda was looking me dead in the eye, openly claiming she was the generous savior of his entire tech empire. David would have desperately, deeply wanted the family to be taken care of. She continued, laying her cold, manicured hand firmly over mine. "He always said that family was the most important, vital thing in the entire world. He told me personally, just last month, that if anything tragic ever happened to him, he specifically wanted me and your father to take full, absolute control of the estate, so you would never have to worry about a single exhausting financial burden. We are just honoring his final dying wishes, Clara. We are just fulfilling his deepest, most heartfelt desires." It was the most vile, repulsive, sickening speech I had ever heard in my entire life. She was aggressively, actively using my dead husband's honor and generosity as a weapon to rob me completely blind. Attorney Vance cleared his throat again and smoothly slid a sleek, heavy gold pen across the table directly toward me. Exactly, Mrs. Sterling, he said aggressively, tapping the top page of the forged documents with his manicured finger. We have carefully prepared a highly comprehensive global settlement and permanent transfer agreement today. By formally signing this final demand, you are legally acknowledging the massive substantial debt David owed to your father. You are also explicitly legally validating his handwritten will, directly transferring all corporate equity, federal patents, and real estate holdings permanently into your parents' names. This incredibly smart move completely bypasses the ugly, lengthy probate courts and saves you from a massive tax burden. You simply surrender all claims to the $5 million estate, and in return, your generous parents will assume all the complicated, heavy corporate liabilities. It is a highly beneficial, completely protective arrangement for a grieving widow. In your extremely delicate emotional state, I stared at the lawyer, making my hands shake violently and deliberately. So if I sign this massive stack of papers, I asked, playing the helpless, terrified victim flawlessly, I am officially, legally confirming that this promissory note and this handwritten will are absolutely real and permanently, legally binding. Vance smiled a very cold, highly arrogant, shark-like grin. Yes, Clara. You are officially confirming their absolute, unassailable authenticity on the formal legal record. Once we all sign these final demands today, the transfer is completely permanent and entirely irrevocable. Your parents will assume full, total, unhindered ownership of the tech company by this afternoon. I slowly looked at Brenda and then at Richard. They were practically vibrating with pure, intense electric greed. They were staring at the gold pen in my hand like starving feral animals staring at raw meat. Are you absolutely, completely certain this is exactly what David truly wanted? I asked, looking deeply directly into my mother's cold eyes. Brenda nodded vigorously, her fake maternal sympathy completely masking her ruthless dark manipulation. I swear it on my very life, Clara, she promised without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. He wanted us to have it all. I slowly picked up the heavy gold pen, but instead of signing my name, I gently pushed the massive stack of documents back toward the center of the mahogany table. If you are taking full permanent legal ownership of everything, I whispered, acting meekly submissive, then you and Dad and Jessica need to sign the primary transfer declarations first. I really need to see you formally accept the massive legal responsibility on the official record before I sign away all my rights. I just need to know you are fully, completely committed to taking care of me. Brenda laughed, a sharp, bright, highly victorious sound. Of course, my sweet sweetheart, she said eagerly, practically snatching the heavy gold pen right out of my trembling hand. We are completely, entirely committed to this family. She quickly signed her name on the bottom line with a large, dramatic, sweeping flourish. She eagerly passed the pen to Richard, who rapidly signed his name with a heavy, violent, greedy stroke. Finally, Jessica forcefully grabbed the pen and scribbled her messy signature, grinning widely from ear to ear. They confidently handed the massive stack of documents back to their sleazy lawyer, who quickly, aggressively applied his official state notary stamp and proudly signed his own name as the legal facilitator of the estate transfer. I sat back in my leather chair in perfect, absolute silence, silently watching the dark blue ink permanently dry on the thick white legal paper. They had just formally, explicitly signed their real names to completely forged documents, officially claiming ownership of a federally protected asset. They had verbally, openly confirmed the absolute authenticity of the massive fraud on a live-running federal recording. They had legally, completely, and irrevocably locked themselves into a massive, airtight criminal conspiracy. They genuinely thought they had just easily won a $5 million corporate empire. They had absolutely no idea they had just happily permanently signed their own federal prison sentences. The ink on the crisp white paper was still wet. Attorney Vance was already reaching for the thick stack of documents, his gold rings clinking against the mahogany table. He had this repulsive, satisfied smirk plastered across his face, the look of a man who thought he had just effortlessly swindled a grieving, heartbroken widow out of $5 million. Brenda let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, pressing her manicured hand against her chest. She looked at me with those wide, fake, sympathetic eyes and told me how incredibly proud David would be of my bravery today. Richard was already calculating his new net worth. You could literally see the greedy math happening behind his eyes. Jessica was adjusting her designer sweater, checking her reflection in the dark-tinted glass of the boardroom window, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire lavish lifestyle was about to disintegrate. I let them enjoy their delusion for exactly 10 more seconds. I let them steep in their unearned, arrogant victory. Then I slowly opened the top drawer of the mahogany desk and pulled out a small black remote control. I kept my hand resting flat on the table, holding the device where they could all clearly see it. The weeping, trembling widow persona that I had maintained for days completely vanished from my face. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back and taking a deep, steady breath of the cool, filtered corporate air. I pressed the single red button in the center of the remote. A loud, heavy electronic clack echoed through the massive boardroom. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of the heavy magnetic security locks engaging on the thick frosted glass double doors at the back of the room. Richard flinched violently at the sound, his head snapping toward the exit. Before any of them could even formulate a question, a low mechanical hum began to vibrate from the ceiling above us. A massive state-of-the-art digital projector screen slowly descended, unrolling itself completely, hiding the breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The sudden loss of natural light instantly changed the entire atmosphere of the room, making it feel like a cold, sterile interrogation chamber. Vance narrowed his eyes, his slick professional demeanor faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Clara, what exactly is going on here?" he asked, his voice losing a bit of his previous aggressive bite. Why did the doors just lock? I did not answer him immediately. I simply stared at my mother, watching the confusion slowly warp the edges of her perfectly rehearsed, sympathetic smile. I wanted her to feel the exact same sheer suffocating panic that I felt when I stood alone in the freezing rain at the cemetery. "Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly flat and entirely steady. "Do you remember where you were last Tuesday at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon?" Brenda blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. She glanced nervously at Richard and then back at me. "What kind of bizarre question is that, Clara?" She stammered, feigning maternal concern. "I was with you, sweetheart. We were all at the cemetery, saying our final painful goodbyes to David." I shook my head very slowly. "No, you were not," I replied, staring directly into her lying eyes. "I turned around by the graveside looking for you and Dad and Jessica. But your folding chairs were completely empty. I thought you had just gone back to the car to escape the torrential downpour. I thought you were just overwhelmed by the immense tragedy of burying your son-in-law. But you were not seeking shelter from the freezing rain, were you? You were actively seeking shelter from the law." I pressed the second button on the small black remote. The high-definition corporate surround sound speakers, perfectly engineered for massive boardroom presentations, crackled to life. The audio began with the muffled, scratchy sound of fabric rubbing against a microphone. I watched my mother's face as the ambient noise shifted to the sharp acoustics of a professional office. Then my father Richard's voice boomed through the speakers, clearing his throat. Jessica's impatient, irritated voice, completely devoid of any sorrow, loudly asked if they were sure this illegal plan was going to work. Attorney Vance's slick, greedy voice proudly declared that I would not even know what hit me. The color instantly and completely drained from Brenda's face. Her jaw went completely slack, her mouth hanging wide open in sheer unadulterated horror. Richard gripped the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning absolute bone white, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked glass doors. Jessica let out a sharp, terrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The audio continued playing flawlessly, capturing every single vile, disgusting word of their criminal conspiracy. It captured Brenda coldly, declaring that my grief made me a weak, easy target, and that she refused to let David's $5 million tech startup equity slip through her fingers just because her daughter wanted to play the grieving widow. It captured Vance meticulously, laying out the exact mechanics of forging the backdated promissory note and creating the fake holographic will to completely freeze my bank accounts and force me into immediate sudden poverty. The sheer profound cruelty of their own voices echoing in that pristine corporate boardroom was absolutely deafening. I sat perfectly still, watching the utter devastation wash over their arrogant faces. Vance was sweating profusely now, aggressively pulling at the collar of his expensive pinstripe suit, looking like a trapped animal, realizing he had walked directly into a massive snare. "Stop this!" Brenda suddenly shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, panicked frequency. "Turn that off right now, Clara. That is completely illegal. You cannot record private confidential conversations." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished wood. "You accidentally pocket-dialed my dead husband's phone from your designer purse while you were sitting in your lawyer's office actively plotting to steal his entire legacy," I stated coldly, cutting through her pathetic hysteria. It went straight to his synchronized cloud voicemail. There is absolutely nothing illegal about saving a voicemail that you willingly, carelessly broadcast directly to my household. But we are not finished yet. I continued, not allowing them a single second to recover their shattered composure. I tapped the remote again. The massive projector screen at the end of the room suddenly illuminated, casting a bright, harsh light across their terrified faces. The screen displayed a stunningly clear 4K resolution video. It was the hidden camera footage from my living room, perfectly capturing the events of Saturday night. The video showed Brenda and Jessica walking through my front door carrying their aluminum foil-covered casseroles, wearing their deeply offensive masks of fake sympathy. It showed me weeping on the velvet sofa, looking completely helpless and utterly broken. I watched my own family stare in absolute silent horror as the video played out their final fatal mistake. The high-quality audio captured Brenda handing me the thick manila folder, aggressively lying straight to my face. It captured her explicitly, clearly stating that the document was merely a routine temporary tax form, designed to protect my home from greedy probate courts. It perfectly recorded her explicitly promising that the house would be transferred right back to me once the legal dust settled. I watched Vance stare at the screen, his eyes wide with absolute professional terror. He knew exactly what he was watching. He was watching his clients commit explicit documented fraud, coercion, and elder abuse equivalents on high-definition video. The camera angle gracefully switching to the hidden lens I had perfectly positioned inside the picture frame on the mantel. The screen displayed a massive crystal-clear extreme close-up of my hands resting on the coffee table. It showed Brenda practically forcing the blue ink pen into my fingers. And then it showed the ultimate lethal detail. The massive high-definition screen clearly, undeniably showed me carefully, deliberately transferring the pen to my left hand. It showed me awkwardly, intentionally butchering my own signature, dragging the ink across the quitclaim deed in a jagged, mismatched, childish scrawl. It was absolute, undeniable, concrete proof that the signature was made under extreme duress, with deliberate intent to invalidate the incredibly fraudulent contract they were forcing upon me. The video ended and the projector screen faded back to an oppressive stark black. The silence that instantly slammed back into the grand executive boardroom was heavier and more suffocating than the freezing rain at the cemetery. It was the deafening absolute silence of total catastrophic defeat. The smug, arrogant smirks that had plastered their faces just 15 minutes ago were completely, permanently gone. They were entirely replaced by the raw, naked, visceral terror of people who suddenly realized they were completely and utterly trapped. Richard was breathing in short, frantic, panicked gasps, looking like he was about to suffer a massive coronary event right there in his expensive suit. Jessica was openly weeping, but these were not the fake performative tears she had used to manipulate me. These were real hot tears of absolute self-preservation. Brenda simply stared at the blank black screen, her hands trembling violently. Her entire false reality completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They had walked into this building entirely convinced they were untouchable predators hunting a weak, naive victim. They never bothered to realize that the grieving widow was actually a highly trained senior financial analyst. And they definitely had no idea that they had just proudly formally signed their forged fraudulent claims right in front of a hidden audience of heavily armed federal investigators. I sat perfectly, completely still, watching their pathetic world burn to absolute ashes, and for the first time in an entire week, I felt the overwhelming, beautiful warmth of true justice. The heavy silence in the grand corporate boardroom was abruptly shattered by a loud, sharp bark of laughter. It was Attorney Vance. He aggressively pushed his chair back from the mahogany table and stood up, smoothing his expensive pinstripe suit with shaking hands. He was desperately trying to project an aura of absolute legal authority. but the heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead completely betrayed his deep internal panic. "That was a very cute little cinematic presentation, Clara," he sneered, pointing a trembling finger at the blank projector screen. "But it means absolutely nothing in the real world. Illinois is a two-party consent state for audio recordings. You secretly recorded us without our explicit permission. That means your little hidden camera video and your incredibly illegally obtained audio files are completely inadmissible in any court of law. A judge will throw them out before we even reach a preliminary hearing. You have absolutely nothing on us except a desperate hysterical attempt to slander your own loving family." Brenda eagerly, immediately latched onto her corrupt lawyer's words like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. The color rushed rapidly back into her pale cheeks. She sat up straighter in her expensive white suit, glaring at me with absolute venomous hatred. "You really thought you were so incredibly clever, Clara," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure toxic malice. "You actually tried to frame us. We came here, out of the goodness of our hearts, to help a grieving unstable widow, and you orchestrated this disgusting illegal trap. Vance is absolutely right. We will sue you for everything you have left. We will have you declared mentally unfit to manage this estate by Friday afternoon." Richard nodded aggressively, crossing his arms over his chest, completely regaining his foolish, unearned arrogance. "You are out of your depth, little girl," he spat. "You always were. You play these little financial games on your computer, but this is the real world. We hold the signed quitclaim deed. We hold the signed global settlement. We are leaving right now to file these documents at the county courthouse, and there is not a single pathetic thing you can do to stop us." I sat perfectly still at the head of the massive table, resting my hands calmly on the cool, polished wood. I did not blink. I did not argue. I just stared at them, letting them completely gorge themselves on this sudden false hope. I knew the federal agents sitting silently behind the mirrored glass observation window were meticulously recording every single threatening word. Vance reached down to grab his heavy leather briefcase, eagerly preparing to pack up the forged documents they had just formally signed. At that exact microsecond, the heavy magnetic security lock on the grand frosted glass doors clicked with a loud echoing mechanical thud. The massive doors slowly pushed open. The entire room turned to look. Standing in the doorway, perfectly framed against the bright corporate hallway, was Marcus. He was no longer the exhausted, rain-soaked man who had stood on my front porch in the middle of the night. He was wearing a sharp, tailored, dark navy suit. His broad shoulders squared, his jaw set with an immovable absolute resolve. He held two distinct, heavy manila envelopes tightly in his right hand. He stepped into the boardroom, and the heavy glass doors hissed silently shut behind him. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure relief. She practically leaped out of her leather chair, rushing toward him with her arms outstretched. "Oh my God, Marcus, thank God you are here," she cried, throwing herself at him. "Clara has completely lost her mind. She brought us down to this office under false pretenses. She hid cameras in her living room and recorded us illegally. She's trying to say we are stealing from her. You need to talk some sense into her right now, Marcus. Tell her she is acting completely insane and ruining our entire family." Marcus did not wrap his arms around his wife. He did not offer her a comforting smile. He simply stared down at her with a look of such profound, absolute disgust that Jessica physically recoiled, taking a stumbling step backward. He bypassed her, completely refusing to speak a single word to her. He walked purposefully down the length of the long mahogany table, completely ignoring Brenda and Richard's confused, shifting glares. He stopped exactly at my side, standing firmly shoulder to shoulder with me and attorney Sarah Jenkins. The heavy, absolute silence returned to the boardroom, thick and suffocating. Marcus looked directly at attorney Vance, who was still clutching the handle of his briefcase. Then he looked at Richard and Brenda. Finally, his dark, cold eyes settled on Jessica, who was standing near the door looking completely bewildered and suddenly deeply terrified. "My name is Marcus James Sterling." He began, his voice echoing through the massive room with a deep, booming authority that commanded absolute attention. "And I am not here to talk sense into my sister-in-law. I am here in my official legal capacity." Marcus lifted the first heavy manila envelope and tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed right next to the stack of forged documents my family had just proudly signed. He pulled out a thick bound stack of official legal paperwork embossed with heavy golden notary seals. 6 months ago, Marcus continued his voice, cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. David and Clara came to this exact office to completely secure their future against parasitic toxic people. They legally, irreversibly transferred every single asset they owned into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust. They transferred the deed to their home. They transferred all liquid capital. They transferred every single share of the $5 million technology startup equity and the associated federal patents. As of 6 months ago, David Sterling owned absolutely nothing in his personal name. Vance's slick face suddenly drained of all its remaining color. His hand slowly slipped off the handle of his briefcase. Brenda and Richard simply stared at Marcus, completely incapable of processing the massive words he was speaking. An irrevocable blind trust requires a named independent executor to manage and distribute its assets, Marcus stated, keeping his eyes locked fiercely on Richard. David legally appointed me as the sole exclusive trustee of the Sterling estate. I am the only living human being on this earth who possesses the legal authority to transfer, sell, or liquidate a single dime of that $5 million portfolio. Clara does not have the power to surrender those assets to you, even if she wanted to. Marcus pointed a heavy, accusatory finger directly at the forged documents resting in front of Vance. The quitclaim deed you forced Clara to sign on camera is completely legally void because she does not hold the title to that house. The trust holds the title. The backdated promissory note you forged, claiming David pledged his company as collateral, is completely worthless because David did not hold the equity to pledge. The holographic will you fabricated is absolute garbage because a personal will cannot ever supersede a previously established irrevocable trust. You spent your entire weekend forging documents for an estate that simply does not exist. A low, pathetic whining sound escaped Brenda's throat. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, her perfectly manicured reality violently crashing down around her. But you made one incredibly massive fatal error, Marcus said, leaning slightly forward, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deeply menacing register. While your forged documents are completely useless for stealing the money, they are absolutely perfect for a federal indictment. David's technology startup holds 3 highly classified federal patents. The trust that currently shields those patents is a federally protected financial entity. By bringing your forged documents into this room today and officially formally signing your real names, claiming ownership over those specific assets, you have actively attempted to defraud the federal government. Vance stumbled backward, his expensive leather chair squeaking loudly against the floor. He bumped into the wall, staring at the documents on the table as if they were literally covered in lethal venom. "You set us up," he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "You brought us here to formally execute the fraud on the record. We did not force you to forge a dead man's signature," Marcus replied coldly. "We did not force you to illegally extract $250,000 from a federally insured bank using a fake power of attorney. We simply gave you a quiet, empty room to confidently, proudly hang yourselves with your own unmitigated greed. And since we are inside a federal corporate facility right now, your little 2-party consent state rule regarding the audio recordings is completely, totally irrelevant to the federal agents actively listening to you from the adjoining observation room. The absolute sheer terror that washed over my family was a beautiful, spectacular sight." Richard grabbed his chest, gasping for air, as the full catastrophic weight of his felony bank fraud crashed down upon him. Brenda began weeping hysterically, real visceral tears of absolute total panic, shaking her head aggressively as if she could simply deny reality itself. Vance looked frantically toward the frosted glass doors, clearly calculating a desperate physical escape before the authorities walked in. But Marcus was not finished. He turned away from the deeply corrupt lawyer and the sobbing parents. He turned his attention directly to Jessica. She was pressing her back flat against the far wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her designer sweater, her eyes wide with total, devastating fear. "Marcus, you cannot do this to us," she cried, her voice cracking pathetically. "We are married. We have children. We are a family. You cannot let them send my parents to federal prison. You cannot do this to your own wife." Marcus did not flinch. His face was a mask of pure, absolute sorrow, mixed with an unyielding iron resolve. He slowly raised the second thinner manila envelope he had brought into the room. He stepped deliberately toward the end of the table and forcefully slid the envelope across the smooth, polished mahogany. It traveled perfectly straight, stopping exactly at the edge of the table, right in front of where Jessica was cowering. "I am not doing a single thing to you, Jessica," Marcus said, his voice echoing with a profound, devastating finality. "You did this to yourself the exact moment you sat at our kitchen island and meticulously practiced forging the signature of a man you knew I loved like a brother. You did this the exact moment you actively plotted to leave your own grieving sister completely homeless and destitute. You did this when you prioritized your insatiable toxic greed over the absolute basic fundamental decency of human life." Jessica stared down at the crisp white envelope. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely reach out to touch it. "What is that?" she whispered, a single terrified tear tracking through her expensive makeup. "Those are divorce papers," Marcus stated coldly, brutally terminating their life together in one single breath. He did not break eye contact with her. "And attached to those divorce papers is a highly expedited emergency petition for full sole physical and legal custody of our 2 children." Jessica let out a loud, agonizing scream, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically shot. "No," she wailed, falling to her knees right there on the corporate boardroom floor. "No, Marcus, please. You cannot take my babies away from me. You cannot take my children. I will do anything. I will fix this. Please do not take them." "You actively, willingly, knowingly participated in a massive federal criminal conspiracy," Marcus replied, looking down at her sobbing form with absolute total detachment. "You conspired to commit severe felony wire fraud and corporate espionage. I will absolutely not, under any circumstances, allow my children to be raised by a mother who possesses zero moral conscience and who is about to be indicted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have already secured a temporary protective order from a family court judge based on the explicit documented evidence of your ongoing felony crimes. You are officially ordered to vacate our family home by 5 o'clock this evening." The sound of Jessica's desperate wailing filled the grand boardroom, bouncing sharply off the high-definition screens and the thick glass walls. Brenda scrambled out of her chair, desperately rushing over to fall on the floor next to her favorite golden child, wrapping her arms around her weeping daughter. Richard stood frozen, completely paralyzed by the utter, total systemic destruction of his entire world. They were all completely, entirely broken. The massive, impenetrable, arrogant facade they had worn for my entire miserable existence was absolutely irrevocably shattered into a million tiny bloody pieces. I sat quietly in my leather chair at the head of the table, perfectly still, perfectly composed. I looked at the crumpled, pathetic mess of my deeply toxic family, crying on the expensive hardwood floor. They had planned to take my house. They had planned to take my $5 million safety net. They had planned to take my sanity. Instead, they had literally handed me the absolute perfect ammunition to completely, permanently eradicate them from my life. The federal agents were waiting silently right behind the mirrored glass. The trap had forcefully, violently snapped shut, crushing every single bone of their corrupt criminal enterprise. And the absolute most satisfying, beautiful part of the entire magnificent victory was that they had personally, confidently, eagerly tightened the noose around their own greedy necks. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by a sharp, mechanical whirring sound. I looked past the crumpled forms of my deeply corrupt family and gave a single sharp nod toward the thick mirrored glass wall at the far end of the boardroom. Instantly, the electronic privacy blinds that had concealed the adjoining observation room snapped violently upward. The loud clattering sound made Richard jump completely out of his skin. The dark-tinted glass suddenly became perfectly transparent. Standing shoulder to shoulder in the brightly lit adjacent office were 6 federal investigators and 2 local fraud detectives. They were all wearing dark tactical vests with heavy gold badges hanging from their necks, and they were all staring directly at my parents with absolute predatory focus. The lead FBI agent was holding a professional communication headset to his ear, his face a mask of cold, unyielding authority. The sheer physical presence of the armed federal team, standing just inches away behind the glass, hit my family like a massive physical tidal wave. Their false reality completely evaporated. Attorney Vance was the first to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. He scrambled backward, completely abandoning his heavy leather briefcase and the forged documents on the mahogany table. He pressed his back against the wall, breathing in ragged gasps. "You set us up," he hissed, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "We have absolute undeniable proof of your explicit criminal conspiracy." I replied, my voice entirely steady. "You verbally authenticated forged documents on a live federal wire. You're completely, entirely finished." The heavy magnetic security locks on the grand boardroom doors clicked open once again. 3 uniformed police officers and 2 heavily armed federal agents marched purposefully into the pristine room. The heavy clatter of their boots against the hardwood floor sounded like the drumbeat of systemic karma. They carried heavy steel handcuffs gleaming sharply under the bright corporate lights. Richard James, the lead federal agent, stated, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. "You are officially under arrest for multiple counts of severe felony wire fraud, interstate criminal conspiracy, and the attempted defrauding of a federally protected financial trust. Turn around and place your hands flat against the wall immediately." Richard did not even try to run, He did not try to argue. He simply completely deflated. His arrogant posture completely collapsed. He silently turned, placing his hands against the wall, letting the officer snap the steel cuffs around his wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply through the room. Vance tried to raise his hand, stammering out desperate pleas about attorney-client privilege, claiming he was misled. The federal agent grabbed his shoulder, spun him around and cuffed him, reading his rights in a rapid monotone. Jessica was still sobbing hysterically on the floor, clutching the thick envelope containing her divorce and custody papers. When the officer pulled her to her feet, Jessica thrashed, screaming Marcus' name, begging for a mercy she never showed me. Marcus did not even blink. He stood completely rigid, his face carved out of pure stone, watching his corrupt, treacherous wife being actively restrained and cuffed. Then the officers moved directly toward Brenda. My mother pushed herself back into the leather chair, her immaculate white suit looking ridiculous against the reality of her impending prison sentence. When the officer grabbed her wrist, Brenda violently, forcefully yanked her arm away. Her eyes went completely wild, filled with a toxic, dangerous, desperate fury. She looked frantically around the room until her crazed gaze locked directly onto me. "Clara," she screamed, her voice tearing through the room like shattered glass. "You call them off right now. You tell these men this is all a massive, terrible misunderstanding. I am your mother. You cannot do this to blood. You are my daughter, and you owe me everything." She was screaming so loudly her neck veins were violently bulging. She was actively, fiercely clinging to her ultimate favorite weapon, the heavy toxic guilt of family obligation. I slowly stood up from my leather chair at the head of the mahogany table. I walked calmly, deliberately around the massive table until I was standing less than 2 feet away from the woman who had spent my entire life completely tearing me down. I looked her dead in the extremely panicked eyes, completely, entirely immune to her frantic emotional manipulation. "You gave up the title of mother the exact moment you walked away from my husband's grave," I stated, my voice perfectly cold, deeply echoing with absolute undeniable truth. "You chose your greed over your own child. You chose to be a predator, and today you finally found out what happens when the prey bites back." Brenda stared at me completely, entirely, utterly silenced. For the very first time in 28 miserable years, she finally recognized that I was completely, entirely unreachable. She had absolutely no power left. Her toxic strings were permanently, violently cut. The federal agent forcefully grabbed both of her arms, twisting them firmly behind her back and snapping the cold, heavy steel handcuffs securely over her wrists. She let out one final pathetic, whimpering sob as she was physically, forcefully marched toward the heavy glass doors. I stood tall and completely perfectly still, watching the entire parade of absolute systemic justice unfold. I watched the armed officers physically escort Richard, Jessica, Brenda, and their corrupt, sleazy lawyer straight out of the Grand Executive boardroom in a tight, humiliating single-file line. The incredibly loud clinking sounds of their heavy metal handcuffs slowly faded down the long corporate hallway, completely, entirely disappearing into the secure elevators. They were gone. The toxic infection that had plagued my entire existence was fully, permanently, surgically removed. I looked over at Marcus and Sarah, feeling the heavy, deep corporate silence rush back into the pristine room. We had won. The $5 million empire was perfectly, totally secure, and my beautiful dead husband's brilliant legacy was completely, finally safe. It has been exactly one entire year since those heavy frosted glass boardroom doors permanently closed behind my deeply corrupt family. The sweeping legal aftermath of that single defining day was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. The federal indictment hit my parents like a massive runaway freight train. Brenda and Richard desperately tried to fight these severe federal charges, draining every single cent of their remaining savings on highly expensive defense attorneys. But those expensive, slick lawyers could do absolutely nothing against the crystal-clear, high-definition hidden camera video and the pristine live federal audio recordings. My parents went completely, utterly bankrupt before the trial even officially began. Last month, a stern federal judge finally handed down their strict mandatory sentences. They both received 10 full years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for committing massive wire fraud and coordinating a severe interstate criminal conspiracy. There is absolutely no early parole in the federal prison system. They will spend the next entire decade sitting in cold, quiet concrete cells with absolutely nothing but their overwhelming toxic greed and the shattered, pathetic remains of their massive egos to keep them company. When the judge read the final verdict, my mother openly, violently wept in the center of the crowded courtroom, desperately begging the judge for a mercy she never once showed me. I sat quietly in the very back row watching her cry, and for the very first time in my entire existence, I felt absolutely nothing. My older sister, Jessica, faced an equally devastating total reality check. When Marcus officially presented the explicit, undeniable, documented evidence of her active, willing participation in a major federal crime, the Stern family court judge did not hesitate for a single second. She was permanently, instantly stripped of all physical and legal custody of their 2 young children. She's currently living entirely alone in a tiny, cramped, rented room on the dark, gloomy outskirts of the city. She's completely, totally alienated from the lavish, wealthy, high society circles she once so desperately worshipped. She now works a highly exhausting minimum wage retail job just to barely scrape together her strict court-ordered monthly child support payments. Every single bit of the unearned, extravagant luxury she felt so incredibly deeply entitled to has completely vanished into thin air. I completely refuse to let their incredibly dark, toxic legacy touch David's beautiful, brilliant empire. Using the completely secure, irrevocable blind trust, Marcus and I proudly established the David Sterling Memorial Foundation. We officially dedicated a massive, substantial portion of the highly successful startup equity to actively fund comprehensive advanced educational programs and significant technology grants for underprivileged youth across the entire country. We specifically, meticulously target young kids who possess brilliant, highly capable minds, but severely lack basic, essential financial resources to succeed. David always deeply, fiercely believed in lifting marginalized people up, and now his incredible name is permanently, globally attached to absolute life-changing opportunities. He is beautifully, actively saving bright, promising futures every single day and ensuring his legacy remains entirely pure. Marcus and his 2 wonderful growing children are a constant, incredibly warm, loving presence in my daily life. We spend our quiet, peaceful weekends together, hosting long, wonderful Sunday dinners in my bright, sunlit kitchen, filling the entire house with loud, genuine laughter and complete, absolute warmth. The heavy, crushing, suffocating silence that used to entirely drown my home is completely, permanently gone forever. We deeply, fiercely protected each other when the absolute worst of humanity actively tried to tear us down to the bare studs. I have finally found deep, profound, completely unshakable peace. I used to deeply think that true valid family was strictly, rigorously defined by shared genetics and rigid biological obligation. I used to desperately believe that I had to constantly, ruthlessly sacrifice my own basic fundamental happiness to endlessly try and earn the elusive love of the terrible people who raised me. But I finally fully realized the absolute beautiful truth. True family is not about DNA at all. True family is about fierce, unwavering, absolute loyalty. It is about the courageous, strong people who firmly stand right beside you in the absolute darkest freezing rain and absolutely refuse to let the starving, vicious wolves drag you down. If you are watching this video right now and carrying the crushing, immense weight of a highly toxic, demanding family that treats you exactly like a disposable, automated teller machine, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Put that heavy, massive burden down immediately. You absolutely do not owe your beautiful life, your precious sanity, or your hard-earned financial success to terrible people who exclusively only view you as a convenient financial asset. Setting firm, unyielding personal boundaries is absolutely never a cruel betrayal. It is a vital, necessary act of basic human survival. You have every single fundamental right to permanently, confidently walk away from anyone who actively, maliciously manipulates your deep emotional vulnerabilities for their own selfish, greedy personal gain. Do not ever let anyone falsely convince you that enduring brutal psychological abuse is the necessary required price of simple family loyalty. You are entirely allowed to aggressively protect your own peace and completely shut the heavy door on toxic abusers. If my personal journey deeply touched your heart today, or if it finally gave you the quiet, profound courage you desperately, secretly needed, please take a quick second to hit that like button, completely subscribe to the channel, and turn on your bell notifications so you never miss another empowering video. I genuinely deeply want to hear your personal story today. Tell me down in the comments section right now, have you ever had to permanently cut off incredibly toxic family members to save your own life? How did you finally find the immense internal strength to confidently walk away? I sit down and personally read every single one of your incredibly brave comments because this strong, supportive community is completely built on our shared honest truth. Take incredible, gentle care of yourself today. You absolutely, completely deserve genuine, unconditional love, and I will see you in the very next story.